Before the story begins, subscribe to the channel and leave a like for more chilling tales and unforgettable mysteries.
It was the 31st of December in the year 1997, and I stood alone on the frozen road that led to the Whitmore farmstead in the hills of eastern Kentucky, watching the last light of the dying year bleed out across the horizon like a wound that would never heal. The air was sharp enough to cut glass, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and something else, something older, something that reminded me of the copper tang of blood mixed with the mustiness of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and my breath came out in thick white plumes that hung in the still air before dissipating into the gathering darkness. I could feel the cold seeping through my heavy wool coat, through my layered shirts, through my skin, all the way down to the marrow of my bones. But I had learned long ago that the worst cold does not come from the weather. The worst cold comes from standing in the presence of something that should not exist, something that has crawled up from the depths of a darkness so absolute that it makes the void between stars seem warm by comparison. My name is Ezekiel Thorne, and I have been hunting demons for 43 years. I was 17 years old when I witnessed my first possession, when I watched my grandmother Miriam speak in a voice that did not belong to her, a voice that sounded like stones grinding together in the belly of the earth. I was 17 when I learned that the stories whispered around campfires and written in forgotten books were not merely stories at all. They were warnings. They were field guides. They were the desperate attempts of those who came before us to prepare the next generation for a war that has been raging since before humanity learned to write its own name. I am 60 years old now, and I have seen things that would shatter the minds of ordinary men and women. I have walked into houses where the walls wept blood and the floors breathed like the chest of some enormous sleeping beast. I have spoken with entities that existed before the first light touched the first dawn, beings so ancient that they remember when the earth was nothing but fire and chaos. I have performed exorcisms that lasted for days, my voice growing hoarse and my body growing weak while something older than sin itself screamed obscenities in languages that humanity has never spoken. I have held the hands of the dying as they told me what they saw waiting for them on the other side. And I have seen the terror in their eyes that told me their visions were not hallucinations, but glimpses of a truth we are not meant to know. I have some stories to tell you. Not all of them end well. Most of them do not end at all, not really, because the darkness I have spent my life fighting does not recognize endings. It simply waits. It watches. It remembers. And when you think you have won, when you think you have banished the shadow and sealed the door and salted the earth, that is precisely when it begins to smile. Let me start with that night, that last night of 1997, because it was the night that taught me the most important lesson a demon hunter can learn. It was the night that showed me how small I truly was, how vast the darkness stretched, and how foolish I had been to believe that 43 years of experience had prepared me for what lurked in the Whitmore farmstead at the edge of the world. I had received the call 3 days earlier, on the morning of December 28th. The voice on the other end of the telephone belonged to a woman named Constance Whitmore, and her words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like frightened animals fleeing a burning forest. Her father, she told me, had not been himself for 6 weeks. It had started small, the way it always starts small. He forgot words. He stared at walls for hours at a time. He stopped sleeping. Then he started speaking in tongues, old tongues, languages that sounded like they had been scraped off the walls of caves where no human hand had ever painted. Then he started hurting himself, clawing at his own skin until the blood ran down his arms and pooled on the floor of the room where they had locked him. Then he started hurting others. Her mother, Constance told me, was in the hospital. Her brother, she told me, had not spoken since he found their father standing over their mother's unconscious body, smiling that smile that was not a smile, that expression that looked like a smile, only if you had never seen a human being smile before and were trying to recreate the expression from a description in a book. The local priest had come, she told me, and the local priest had left, and now the local priest would not return her calls. She had heard my name from a cousin, who had heard it from a friend, who had heard it from someone else, a chain of whispers that stretched back through the shadows to whatever reputation I had built over 4 decades of work. She needed help, she told me. She needed someone who knew what they were doing. She needed someone who would not run. I told her I would be there on the 31st. I told her to keep her father locked in his room and to not, under any circumstances, speak to him or respond to anything he said. I told her to hang iron above his door and to draw a circle of salt around the bed where he lay. I told her to pray, not because I believed prayer would save her father, but because I believed it might save her. Then I hung up the telephone and began to pack my bag, the same leather bag that had belonged to my grandfather before me and his father before him, the bag that held the tools of a trade that should not exist. I drove for 2 days to reach Kentucky, stopping only for gasoline and black coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in the fires of perdition itself. The roads grew narrower as I traveled east. The towns grew smaller, and by the time I reached the county where the Whitmores lived, I might as well have been driving through a landscape from another century. The farmhouses sat far apart from each other, separated by fields that lay dormant beneath blankets of frost, and the people I passed looked at my car with the suspicious eyes of those who rarely saw strangers and had learned not to trust them when they did. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that promised snow but did not deliver it, as if the weather itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I found the Whitmore farmstead at the end of a road that had not been paved in at least 3 decades, a road that wound through skeletal trees and over frozen streams until it deposited me at the foot of a hill, where the old house stood like a monument to everything that had gone wrong in the 150 years since it had been built. It was a large house, larger than most farmhouses in these parts, with a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle, and windows that stared out at the world like the eyes of something dead. The paint had long since peeled away from the wooden siding, leaving the boards exposed to the elements, gray and weathered and somehow hungry. A single light burned in an upstairs window, a flickering yellow glow that told me candles were being used instead of electricity, either because the power had been cut or because someone inside understood that certain things were best faced in the oldest light. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching that light flicker, feeling the cold press against the glass like hands trying to find a way in. The last rays of sunlight were fading rapidly now, and soon the darkness would be complete. The kind of darkness that existed only in places far from cities and highways and all the trappings of modern life that we use to convince ourselves we are safe. I had faced that darkness many times before. I had walked into it with my bag in one hand and my faith in the other, and I had walked out again, sometimes whole and sometimes broken but always alive. But there was something about this place, about this gathering night, about the way the wind had fallen utterly silent that made me hesitate. There was something about the stillness that felt like the held breath before a scream. I got out of the car and walked toward the house. Constance Whitmore met me at the door. She was a woman in her late 30s, with dark hair that had been hastily pulled back from a face that bore the marks of too many sleepless nights. Her eyes were red-rimmed and raw, but they were also sharp, alert, watching everything with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that danger could come from any direction at any moment. She wore a heavy cardigan over a flannel shirt, and I noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she held the door open for me, though whether from cold or fear or exhaustion I could not say. She led me through the entrance hall without speaking, past walls covered in faded wallpaper that depicted pastoral scenes of shepherds and sheep, past a grandfather clock that had stopped at 3 minutes past 3, past doorways that opened onto rooms where furniture sat beneath white sheets like ghosts waiting to be revealed. The air inside the house was cold, nearly as cold as the air outside, and it carried with it a smell that I recognized immediately, the smell of something rotting, something dying, something that had already died and was now being worn like a suit by whatever had moved in to take its place. I breathed through my mouth and kept walking. We climbed the stairs to the second floor, and with each step the temperature seemed to drop further until by the time we reached the landing at the top, I could see frost forming on the wooden handrail beneath my fingertips. The hallway stretched ahead of us, lit by candles that had been placed at irregular intervals along the floor, their flames dancing in a breeze that came from nowhere, that should not have existed in a house with all its windows and doors closed tight. The shadows between the candles seemed too deep, too thick, more like solid walls of darkness than mere absences of light, and I had the unmistakable feeling that something was watching us from within those shadows, something patient and curious and utterly without mercy. Constance stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. It was a heavy door, made of solid oak that had been reinforced with iron bands, and someone had drawn symbols on it in what looked like charcoal mixed with blood. I recognized some of the symbols from the old books I had studied over the years, symbols of binding and warding, symbols meant to keep something contained. But I also saw that some of the symbols were wrong, drawn by hands that did not fully understand what they were doing, and I knew that whatever protection they offered was incomplete at best. "He has been quiet for the last few hours," Constance whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own breathing. "He screamed all morning. He screamed until I thought his throat would tear itself apart. Then he just stopped. The silence is almost worse." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The screaming was terrible, yes, but it was also honest. It was a declaration of war, an announcement of intent. The silence was something else entirely. The silence was calculation. The silence was strategy. The silence was whatever dwelt within her father, taking stock of its situation and making plans. "I need you to wait downstairs," I told her. "No matter what you hear, do not come up here. Do not open this door. Do not speak to whatever speaks to you. If something goes wrong, if you hear nothing from me by dawn, you need to leave this house and never come back. You need to find a church and tell them what happened here. Do you understand?" Constance looked at me with eyes that held the kind of desperate hope I had seen too many times before. The hope of someone who had been drowning for weeks and had finally spotted what might be a piece of driftwood in the churning waters. She nodded once, then turned and walked back down the hallway, her footsteps receding into the darkness until I could no longer hear them at all. I stood alone before the door. I set my bag down on the floor and opened it, revealing the contents I had assembled over 43 years of work. There were vials of holy water from 7 different churches, blessed by priests and ministers and rabbis who understood that the darkness did not discriminate by faith. There were chains of iron, cold and heavy, forged in the old ways by a blacksmith in Vermont who knew what his work would be used for and asked no questions. There were books, small leather-bound volumes filled with prayers and incantations in Latin and Hebrew and Aramaic and older languages still, languages that had been old when Rome was young. There was salt, pure and white, enough to draw a circle large enough to contain a man. And there was my grandfather's crucifix, a simple cross of silver that had been carried by 4 generations of demon hunters, its surface worn smooth by countless hands and countless prayers. I took the crucifix and hung it around my neck. I filled my pockets with salt and holy water. I tucked one of the smaller books into my coat. Then I stood up, placed my hand on the iron handle of the door, and pushed. The room beyond was dark, but not entirely. A single candle burned on a dresser against the far wall, its flame barely moving in air that felt thick and heavy, air that pressed against my lungs like wet wool and made each breath an effort. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges in the plaster that had been made by human fingernails, and those scratches formed patterns, shapes, words, and alphabets that I recognized but could not read. The floor was littered with debris, overturned furniture and torn clothing and things that might have been food once but had rotted into unrecognizable masses. And there, in the center of the room, sat a man on a bed with an iron frame, a man who had once been Ezra Whitmore and was now something else entirely. He was thin, far too thin for a man who had been healthy 6 weeks ago, his skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp, as if whatever was inside him was reshaping his body to better suit its needs. His arms were covered in wounds, some fresh and some scabbed over, all self-inflicted, all arranged in patterns that might have been random madness or might have been something far more deliberate. His hair, which Constance had told me was normally brown and neatly combed, now hung in gray tangles around a face that had aged decades in less than 2 months. But it was his eyes that told me everything I needed to know. They were open, watching me, and they were wrong. The color was still brown, the shape was still human, but there was something behind them. Something looking out through those windows of flesh and bone. Something that had never been human and never would be. Ezekiel Thorne, the thing inside Ezra Whitmore said, and its voice was not Ezra's voice. It was deeper, rougher, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountainside in the dead of night. "I have been expecting you." I did not respond. I had learned long ago that engaging with the entity only gave it power, only fed its hunger for attention and reaction. Instead, I began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the room, reaching into my pocket and letting salt fall from my fingers in a continuous line, closing the circle that would contain whatever happened next. "You think salt will hold me?" the thing continued, and there was amusement in its voice, a dark and ancient humor that made my skin crawl. "You think your little rituals and your little prayers will make any difference? I have watched your kind scratch at the edges of power for thousands of years. I watched when the first of you tried to bind us with words and symbols. I watched when you built your churches and your temples and convinced yourselves that faith was armor. I am older than your faith, Ezekiel Thorne. I was old when the first human being looked up at the stars and felt afraid." I completed the circle and turned to face the bed. The thing that had been Ezra Whitmore was smiling now. That wrong smile that Constance had described, and I could see too many teeth in that smile. Teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Teeth that did not quite fit in the mouth that held them. "I am not here to hold you," I said, my voice steady despite the cold that was seeping into my bones, despite the fear that clawed at the edges of my mind. "I am here to send you back." The thing laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the sound of something dead trying to remember what joy felt like and getting it horribly wrong. "Send me back," it repeated. "Send me back where? Do you even know what I am, little hunter? Do you have any idea what you are dealing with?" I pulled the book from my coat and opened it to a page I had marked days earlier. A page that contained an exorcism rite that had been old when the Catholic Church was young. A rite that had been passed down through secret channels for centuries, preserved by those who understood that the official prayers were often not enough. "In the name of the Father," I began, and the words felt heavy on my tongue, weighted with power and history and the faith of all those who had spoken them before me. The thing on the bed hissed, its smile faltering for just a moment before returning wider than before. "You read from your little book," it said. "You speak your little words, but you do not understand what they mean. You do not understand where they came from." I continued reading, ignoring the voice, ignoring the way the candle flame had begun to flicker wildly, ignoring the way the temperature in the room had dropped so low that I could see my breath forming thick clouds in the air. "I command you, unclean spirit," I said, "to reveal your name." The thing laughed again, but there was something different in the sound now, something that might have been pain, or might have been rage, or might have been both. "You want my name?" it asked. "You think knowing my name will give you power over me? Very well, little hunter. I will give you my name." It leaned forward on the bed, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something else superimposed over Ezra Whitmore's wasted body, something vast and dark and terrible, something with too many eyes and too many mouths and wings that seemed to be made of shadow itself. "I am Balzikar," the thing whispered, and the words seemed to echo in the room, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling and the floor, growing louder instead of fading, until I could feel it vibrating in my chest like the beating of some enormous distant drum. "I am the keeper of the forgotten gate. I am the voice in the deep. I walked the earth before your ancestors crawled from the mud, and I will walk it long after your species has ground itself to dust. You cannot send me back, Ezekiel Thorne. I am not a visitor here. I am coming home." I kept reading. I spoke the words of binding. I spoke the words of banishment. I threw holy water at the thing on the bed and watched it sizzle and steam where it touched Ezra Whitmore's skin. I held up my grandfather's crucifix and felt the entity recoil, felt it retreat deeper into its host, even as it screamed curses in languages that had been dead for millennia. The battle lasted for hours. I do not know exactly how long, because time seemed to move strangely in that room, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. Sometimes it felt like only minutes had passed since I had entered. Other times it felt like days, weeks, an eternity of cold and darkness, and the sound of that terrible voice speaking terrible truths. "You have been doing this for so long," Balzekar said at one point, when my voice had grown hoarse and my arms had grown heavy with exhaustion. 43 years of fighting shadows. And what have you accomplished? What have you won? I did not answer. I kept reading. "Let me tell you what you have won," the thing continued. "You have won nothing. For every door you have closed, 100 more have opened. For every entity you have banished, 1,000 more have been summoned. Your world is full of fools playing with powers they cannot comprehend, drawing circles and speaking words and tearing holes in the fabric of reality. You are not winning this war, Ezekiel Thorne. You are barely slowing us down." I kept reading. The words blurred before my eyes. The cold had seeped so deep into my body that I could no longer feel my fingers or my toes. But I kept reading because that was all I knew how to do. Because stopping meant losing, and losing meant something far worse than death. Somewhere in the distance, I heard bells begin to ring. It was midnight. The old year was dying. The new year was being born. And in that moment of transition, in that liminal space between what was and what would be, I felt something shift in the room. The temperature dropped even further, impossibly further, until it felt like the cold of outer space, the cold between stars, where no warmth has ever reached. The candle flame on the dresser flickered and died. The darkness that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, complete, a darkness so thick and so heavy that it seemed to have weight, seemed to have presence, seemed to have intent. Then, from within that darkness, I heard Ezra Whitmore's voice, his real voice, weak and broken and filled with a despair so profound that it made my heart ache. "Please," he whispered, "please make it stop. I can feel it inside me. I can feel it in every thought, every memory, every part of what I used to be. It is eating me alive. Please. If you cannot save me, then kill me. Kill me and end this." I could not see him in the darkness. I could not see anything at all, but I spoke anyway, spoke into that void with all the conviction I could muster. "I am going to save you," I said. "I am going to send this thing back to whatever pit it crawled out of, and you are going to live. You are going to see your daughter again. You are going to hold your wife's hand again. You are going to walk out of this room and feel the sun on your face and know that the nightmare is over." There was a long silence. Then Balzachar spoke again, and its voice was no longer amused. It was angry. It was hateful. It was the voice of something that had been certain of its victory and was now beginning to doubt. "You cannot save him," the thing said. "He is already mine. His soul has been mine since the moment I entered this vessel. Every second that passes, I consume more of him. Soon there will be nothing left but a hollow shell, and I will wear it forever." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last vial of holy water. I had been saving it for this moment. The moment when all seemed lost. The moment when the darkness felt absolute. It was water from a spring in the hills of Jerusalem, blessed by a dying rabbi who had spent his entire life studying the old ways. Water that was said to carry the weight of thousands of years of faith within its small glass prison. I opened the vial and poured it over my own hands. Then I stepped forward into the darkness, toward the place where I knew the bed must be, toward the place where Ezra Whitmore lay trapped within his own flesh. My hands found his shoulders. I could feel how cold he was, how thin he had become, how the bones seemed to shift and writhe beneath his skin, as if something was rearranging them from within. I could feel Balzacar's rage at my touch, could feel the entity recoiling from the holy water that still clung to my fingers. "In the name of all that is holy," I said, and my voice did not sound like my voice anymore. It sounded like the voice of every hunter who had come before me, every man and woman who had stood against the darkness and refused to yield. "I command you to release this man. I command you to return to the pit from which you came. I command you to go and never return." The thing inside Ezra Whitmore screamed. It was a sound beyond description, a sound that contained within it all the fury and all the hatred and all the cold malevolence of something that had existed since before the foundation of the world. It was a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself, that made the walls shake, and the floor tremble, and the darkness pulse with a terrible, hungry light. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The candle on the dresser flickered back to life. The temperature in the room began to rise. The darkness retreated, flowing out through the cracks in the walls like water draining from a tub. And Ezra Whitmore collapsed in my arms, unconscious but breathing, alive in a way that he had not been alive for 6 weeks. I held him for a long time, listening to the bells in the distance as they continued to ring in the new year, feeling the warmth slowly return to my frozen limbs. I had won. I had sent Balzacar back. I had saved this man and this family from a fate worse than any death I could imagine. But even as I allowed myself a moment of relief, even as I felt the tension in my muscles begin to ease, I heard something that made my blood run cold all over again. It was a whisper, faint and distant, barely audible above the ringing of the bells and the creaking of the old house settling around me. "This is not the end," Balzacar's voice said from somewhere far away, somewhere deep within the darkness that had retreated but had not been destroyed. "I will return. I always return. And when I do, Ezekiel Thorne, I will remember you." I carried Ezra Whitmore out of that room and down the stairs and laid him on the sofa in the living room where his daughter Constance sat waiting, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear and hope and exhaustion. I told her that her father would recover, that the entity had been driven out, that the worst was over. I did not tell her about the whisper I had heard. I did not tell her that Balzacar was not destroyed, only banished, and that banishment was always temporary. Some truths are too heavy for civilians to carry. That is why hunters like me exist. We carry the weight so that others do not have to. I left the Whitmore farmstead as the sun began to rise on the first day of 1998, my body aching with exhaustion and my mind heavy with the memory of what I had faced in that dark room. I drove for hours without stopping, without thinking, without doing anything but putting distance between myself and that place of shadows. But the thing about shadows is that they follow you wherever you go. They wait in the corners of your vision, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between one thought and the next. And no matter how far you run, no matter how fast you drive, they are always there, patient and hungry and eternal. That was not my first encounter with the darkness. It was not my last. In the 43 years I have been doing this work, I have accumulated more stories than I can count, more memories than any one mind should have to hold. Some of them haunt me in my waking hours. Others wait for sleep to ambush me with their horrors. All of them have taught me something, have added another piece to the puzzle I have spent my life trying to assemble. Let me tell you another story. Let me take you back further, to the early years of my career, when I was still learning what it meant to walk in darkness. It was the autumn of 1963, and I was 23 years old, still young enough to believe that courage was stronger than fear and that faith was enough to protect me from anything I might face. I had been hunting demons for 6 years by then, learning my craft from my father, Abraham Thorne, who had learned it from his father before him, a line of demon hunters stretching back to the old country, to a village in Eastern Europe that no longer exists on any map. My father died in the summer of that year, killed during an exorcism that went wrong in ways I still do not fully understand. One moment he was speaking the words of banishment, his voice strong and clear and filled with conviction. The next moment he was on the ground, his eyes staring at nothing, his heart stopped as if some invisible hand had reached into his chest and squeezed until there was nothing left to squeeze. The entity he had been fighting escaped. We never found it again. His death left me alone for the first time in my career, without a mentor, without a guide, without anyone to tell me what to do when the darkness came calling. I thought about quitting. I thought about walking away from this life and finding something normal, something safe, something that would not end with my heart stopped in my chest while some ancient evil laughed at my foolishness. But quitting was not in my blood. My grandfather had not quit when he watched his brother torn apart by something that had been summoned from beneath a church in Bavaria. My father had not quit when he spent 3 days and 3 nights locked in a room with a possessed child, fighting an entity so old and so powerful that it had no name, only hunger. I would not quit either. The case that autumn came to me through a letter, hand-delivered by a young man named Tobias Marsh, who had traveled from a small town in Vermont to find me. His eyes had the look that I would come to know well over the years, the look of someone who had seen something that had broken the world they thought they knew and was desperately searching for someone who could put the pieces back together. The letter was from his grandmother, Prudence Marsh, a woman in her 80s who had been the unofficial keeper of her town's secrets for as long as anyone could remember. She wrote in a cramped, careful hand, each word chosen with precision, each sentence weighted with meaning. "There is something in the Harrow Church," she wrote. "It has been sleeping for a long time, but now it is waking up, and I am too old to stop it. Your father helped us once, many years ago. I am hoping his son will help us again." I traveled to Vermont with Tobias, driving through countryside that blazed with the colors of fall, oranges and reds and yellows that seemed to set the hills on fire. The town was called Blackwater, and it lived up to its name. It sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that seemed to lean inward, blocking out the sky, casting shadows that fell across the narrow streets even at midday. The buildings were old, most of them dating back to the colonial era, their wooden frames weathered by centuries of harsh winters and harsh lives. The people who walked those streets looked at me with eyes that held suspicion and fear and something else, something that might have been hope or might have been desperation or might have been both. Tobias took me to his grandmother's house, a small cottage at the edge of town where the forest began to encroach on civilization, where the trees grew so close together that their branches seemed to whisper to each other even when there was no wind. Prudence Marsh was waiting for us in a rocking chair on her front porch, a small woman wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face a map of wrinkles that told the story of a life lived in hard country, doing hard work. "You look like your father," she said when I climbed the porch steps and stood before her. "Same eyes, same stubborn jaw, same foolishness, I expect, thinking you can fight what cannot be fought." "My father taught me that everything can be fought," I replied. "Even if it cannot be defeated, it can be resisted." She laughed at that, a dry sound like leaves rustling in an autumn wind. "Your father was a good man," she said, "a brave man, but he was wrong about some things. There are forces in this world that do not care about our resistance. They do not even notice it. We are ants to them, Ezekiel Thorne, and our struggles are meaningless." "Then why did you send for me?" "Because meaningless is not the same as hopeless," she said, and there was a fire in her old eyes that I had not expected, a determination that burned beneath the resignation like coals buried under ash. "Because even if we cannot win, we must fight. That is what it means to be human." She told me about the Harrow Church that night, sitting by the fire in her small parlor while Tobias brought us tea that neither of us drank. The church had been built in 1703, she said, by a preacher named Obadiah Harrow, a man who had come to the New World fleeing something in the Old. The official records said he was fleeing religious persecution, but the unofficial records, the secret histories that had been passed down through certain families in Blackwater for generations, told a different story. Obadiah Harrow was a sorcerer, Prudence said. Not a good man who dabbled in dark arts, but a truly evil man who had embraced them fully, who had made pacts with things that should not be named and had gained power beyond anything a mortal should possess. He came to this valley because it was isolated, because it was forgotten, because the veil between our world and other worlds was thin here, thin enough for him to tear it open and reach through. "What did he do?" I asked. "He summoned something," she replied, "something old, something hungry. He bound it beneath the church he built, fed it with sacrifices for decades, used its power to keep himself young while the years piled up around him. When he finally died, the binding held, but it was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be maintained, renewed by each successive generation, and your family has been maintaining it. My family and others, the Marshes, the Blackwoods, the Carters, we have been the guardians of that binding for almost 300 years. But there are fewer of us now than there used to be. The young people leave, the old people die, and the binding grows weaker with each passing decade. What happens if the binding fails completely?" Prudence looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and remembered all of it. "Then it wakes up," she said, "and when it wakes up, it feeds, not just on Blackwater, on everything, on everywhere, on everyone." I went to the Harrow Church the next morning, walking alone through streets that seemed deserted despite the early hour, past houses where curtains twitched in windows and doors remained firmly closed. The church stood at the north end of town, at the top of a small hill that overlooked the valley below, a white clapboard building with a steeple that reached toward a sky the color of old bones. It looked like any other New England church, the kind you might see in postcards or paintings, quaint and peaceful and utterly unremarkable. But I could feel it the moment I stepped onto the church grounds. There was something wrong here, something off, something that made my skin crawl and my heart beat faster in my chest. The air was colder than it should have been, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like copper and rot and something else, something that reminded me of the ozone scent that fills the air before a lightning strike. The front doors of the church were unlocked. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the windows covered by heavy curtains that blocked out the morning light. Pews sat in neat rows on either side of a central aisle, their wood worn smooth by generations of worshippers who had sat in them and prayed to a God they believed would protect them. At the far end of the room, behind a simple wooden pulpit, hung a large wooden cross that was somehow wrong, tilted at an angle that made no sense, as if gravity worked differently in this place. But it was not the cross that drew my attention. It was the floor beneath it. There was a trapdoor there, barely visible in the dim light, its edges marked by grooves in the floorboards where it had been opened and closed countless times over the centuries. I walked down the aisle toward it, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and with each step I took, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger, heavier, more oppressive. I reached the trapdoor and knelt beside it. There were symbols carved into the wood, old symbols, the same kind I had seen in my father's books, the books he had inherited from his father and his father's father. Binding symbols, containment symbols, symbols meant to keep something locked away. But some of the symbols had been scratched out, their lines broken by what looked like claw marks, deep gouges in the wood that had destroyed their power. "You should not be here." The voice came from behind me. I spun around, my hand going to the crucifix at my neck, and saw a man standing in the doorway of the church, silhouetted against the gray light outside. He was tall and thin, dressed in black clothes that might have been a minister's garb, and his face was hidden in shadow. "I am here because I was asked to come," I said. "I am here because something is waking up beneath this church, and someone needs to stop it." The man laughed, a sound that was somehow both amused and sad. "Stop it," he repeated. "You cannot stop it. No one can stop it. Obadiah Harrow could not stop it, and he was the most powerful sorcerer this land has ever known. All he could do was bind it, and even that binding is failing now." "Who are you?" "I am what remains of the Harrow line," the man said, stepping forward into the dim light of the church. "I am the last of my family, the last to know the secrets that have been passed down from father to son for almost 300 years. I saw his face then, and I understood why his voice had sounded both amused and sad. He was dying. His skin was gray and papery, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp. His eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, rimmed with red, filled with a weariness that went beyond exhaustion into something approaching despair. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight far too heavy for any human being to bear and had finally reached the end of his strength. "My name is Elias Harrow," he said, "and I have been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." He told me his story as we sat in the pews of the church, told me about the burden that had been passed down through his family for generations, the duty to maintain the binding that kept the entity beneath the church asleep and contained. He told me about the rituals that had to be performed each year on the winter solstice, the sacrifices that had to be made, the prices that had to be paid. "What kind of sacrifices?" I asked, and my voice was harder than I intended, sharper. Elias looked at me with those tired, dying eyes. "Animals at first," he said, "goats and sheep and cattle. Their blood was enough to feed the binding, to keep it strong. But as the years passed and the entity grew stronger, animals were no longer enough." "People," I said. "Your family has been sacrificing people." "My family has been protecting this town," Elias replied, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to justify what had been done. "We have been protecting this valley, this region, this world. You have no idea what sleeps beneath this floor, Ezekiel Thorne. You have no idea what will be unleashed if the binding fails completely." "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what I am dealing with." He told me. The entity had no name that could be spoken in human tongues. It was old, far older than Balzacar, older than the demons and devils that populated the mythologies of human religions. It was one of the things that had existed before existence itself, a remnant of a chaos that had preceded creation, a fragment of a darkness that had been pushed aside when the light first came into being. It did not think as humans thought. It did not want as humans wanted. It simply was. An endless hunger, an eternal emptiness, a void that consumed everything it touched and was never satisfied. Obadiah Harrow had found a way to bind it, to trap it beneath the church he had built on the thin place between worlds. He had done so not out of altruism, but out of a desire for power. For he had learned to siphon off tiny amounts of the entity's energy and use them to fuel his own dark magic. But even he had known that the binding could not last forever. Even he had known that someday, somehow, the entity would break free. "That day is coming," Elias said. "I can feel it. The binding is weakening faster than it ever has before. The entity is stirring, dreaming, reaching out. It has been sending visions to the people of this town, visions of what it will do when it wakes up, visions of a world consumed by darkness and hunger and despair." "Can the binding be renewed?" I asked. "Can it be strengthened?" Elias shook his head slowly. "The binding requires sacrifice," he said. "Not animal sacrifice, human sacrifice. The life force of a living being, freely given, is the only thing powerful enough to hold the entity in check for another year. That is the price my family has been paying for almost 3 centuries. That is the price I will pay tonight." I stared at him, understanding dawning slowly in my mind. "You are going to sacrifice yourself," I said. "That is why you look like this. You have been preparing." "My son died last spring," Elias said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "My wife died 3 years before that. There is no one left to carry on the Harrow line, no one left to maintain the binding. When I die, it all ends, unless someone else takes up the duty, unless someone else is willing to pay the price." "You are asking me to become the new guardian," I said. "I am asking you to understand," Elias replied. "I am asking you to witness. I am asking you to remember what happens here and to carry that knowledge forward, so that if the binding fails, if the entity wakes up, someone will know what we are dealing with. Someone will have a chance, however small, to fight back." The ritual took place that night, in the basement beneath the church, a space that had been hollowed out of the earth and lined with stone that was older than the church itself, older than the town, older than any human settlement in this land. The walls were covered in symbols, thousands of them, carved into the stone by countless hands over countless years, a tapestry of binding and containment that stretched from floor to ceiling and pulsed with a faint, sickly light. At the center of the room was a pit, a hole in the floor that seemed to descend forever, that seemed to lead down into a darkness so absolute that light itself refused to enter. And from that pit came a sound, a low rhythmic thrumming that I felt in my bones more than I heard with my ears, a sound like a heartbeat, like breathing, like something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman stirring in its sleep. Elias stood at the edge of the pit, dressed in white robes that had been stained with symbols drawn in blood, his own blood, given freely for this purpose. He held a knife in one hand, a blade that was older than the nation we stood in, older than the empires that had risen and fallen across the ocean. "Remember this," he said to me, his voice barely audible above the thrumming that rose from the pit. "Remember what I do here. Remember why." Then he cut his own throat. The blood that poured from the wound did not fall to the floor. It hung in the air for a moment, suspended by forces I could not see, and then it began to flow toward the pit, drawn by the hunger that lurked below. It fell into the darkness, and where it touched the entity, where it fed the binding, the symbols on the walls flared with light, bright and brilliant and somehow terrible. Elias fell to his knees, then fell forward, his body tumbling into the pit before I could reach him, swallowed by the darkness below. I heard no scream, no cry of pain or fear. He was simply gone, consumed by the thing he had spent his life containing. The thrumming from the pit grew softer, quieter, fading back into the silence from which it had come. The symbols on the walls dimmed, their light reduced to a faint glow that was barely visible in the darkness. The binding had been renewed. The entity had been fed. For another year at least, it would sleep. I left Blackwater the next morning, driving south through mountains that no longer seemed to lean inward quite so oppressively, past forests that no longer seemed to whisper quite so hungrily. I told Prudence Marsh what had happened. I told her that Elias Harrow was dead, that the binding had been renewed, that the town was safe for another year. She nodded, unsurprised, as if she had known this was how it would end. "And next year?" she asked. "What happens next year, when there is no Harrow left to pay the price?" I did not have an answer for her. I did not have an answer for myself. All I knew was that somewhere beneath a church in Vermont, something ancient and hungry was sleeping, dreaming its dark dreams, waiting for the day when it would finally wake up and feed. I have been back to Blackwater many times over the years. I have helped maintain the binding as best I could, working with the families who remained, searching for solutions that did not require human sacrifice. We found alternatives, temporary measures, stopgap solutions that bought time without paying the full price. But I always knew, deep down, that those measures would not last forever. I always knew that someday, the entity beneath the Harrow Church would stir again, and there would be no one left to stop it. That knowledge is part of what I carry. That burden is part of who I am. But let me tell you another story. Let me take you to a different place, a different time, a different kind of darkness. It was the winter of 1978, and I was 38 years old, experienced enough to know better, but stubborn enough to go anyway. The case took me to Louisiana, to the bayous south of New Orleans, where the water was black and still, and the cypress trees grew so thick that their branches blocked out the sky. It was a place where the old ways still held sway, where the line between the living and the dead was thin and permeable, where things moved in the shadows that had never been human and never would be. The woman who summoned me was named Evangeline Boudreau, a traiteur, a healer who practiced the folk magic that had been passed down through her family for generations. She was old when I met her, her skin dark and weathered, her eyes bright with a wisdom that went beyond book learning into something deeper and more primal. She lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the swamp, surrounded by bottles and jars and bundles of dried herbs, by candles that burned constantly, and altars to saints whose names I did not recognize. "There is something in the swamp," she told me, her voice carrying the accent of the region, that particular blend of French and English, and something older still, something that has been sleeping for a long time, dreaming its dark dreams beneath the water and the mud. But now it is waking up. Now it is reaching out, and the people are beginning to disappear. The disappearances had started 6 months earlier, she explained. Fishermen who went out on the bayou and never came back. Children who wandered too close to the water's edge and were simply gone. Hunters who ventured too deep into the swamp and were found days later, their bodies drained of blood, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. At first, the local authorities had blamed alligators. Then they had blamed gangs from New Orleans, criminals who used the swamp as a dumping ground for their victims. But Evangeline knew better. Evangeline had seen the truth in her dreams, in the visions that came to her when she slept, in the whispers that echoed in the darkness of her cabin in the deepest hours of the night. "It is called the loup-garou," she said, using the Cajun word for werewolf. "But it is not a werewolf as the stories tell. It is older than that. It is one of the first things, the things that were here before the Europeans came, before the natives crossed the land bridge from Asia, before humans walked this earth at all." I spent 3 weeks in the swamp, tracking the creature, learning its habits, trying to understand what I was dealing with. I talked to the people who lived on the edges of the bayou, the fishermen and trappers and recluses who had made their homes in this strange and beautiful and terrifying place. Most of them would not speak to me at first, suspicious of outsiders, afraid of drawing the creature's attention. But eventually, one by one, they opened up, sharing stories that had been passed down through their families for generations. Stories of the thing in the swamp that had been here forever and would be here forever, that could not be killed and could not be stopped, only avoided, only appeased. One man, an old Cajun named Thibodeau, who had lived on the bayou for 80 years, told me about an encounter he had had as a young man during a flood that had come through in the spring of 1922. He had been out in his boat, checking his traps, when he had seen something rise from the water, something huge and dark and terrible, something with eyes that burned like coals and a mouth that was too wide, too full of teeth. "It looked at me," Thibodeau said, and his voice trembled with the memory, even after more than 50 years. It looked right at me, and I knew in my bones, that it could have killed me, that it could have torn me apart and swallowed me whole, and there was nothing I could have done to stop it. But it did not. It just looked at me for a long moment, and then it sank back beneath the water and was gone. Why? I asked. Why did it let you live? Thibodeau shook his head slowly. I do not know, he said. Maybe I was not enough. Maybe it was not hungry enough. Or maybe it just wanted me to see, wanted me to know that it was there, waiting, watching. Maybe it wanted me to be afraid. I found the creature's lair on my 18th day in the swamp, a submerged cave system beneath an island of solid ground in the heart of the bayou. I had followed the trail of disappearances, mapping out the locations where people had vanished, looking for a pattern, looking for a center. The island was it. Every disappearance had occurred within a few miles of this place, this forgotten patch of dry land surrounded by black water and cypress trees. I waited until nightfall to approach. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be nocturnal, or at least more active after dark, and I wanted to face it at its strongest, to understand what I was dealing with before I tried to defeat it. The moon was full that night, hanging low over the swamp, casting silver light across the water and the trees. I paddled my boat through the narrow channels, following the path I had mapped during the day, until I reached the island and pulled my boat up onto the muddy shore. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of rotting vegetation and stagnant water and something else, something that reminded me of the smell I had encountered in the Whitmore farmstead years later. That copper tang of blood mixed with the mustiness of ancient tombs. The ground beneath my feet was soft and yielding, covered in moss and fallen leaves, and as I walked toward the center of the island, I could feel something watching me, something waiting in the darkness just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I found the entrance to the cave at the base of a massive cypress tree, a hole in the earth that descended into darkness, that seemed to breathe with a rhythm that matched the beating of my own heart. I stood at the edge of that hole for a long time, feeling the cold air that rose from below, smelling the stench of old death and older things, gathering my courage for what I was about to do. Then I descended. The cave was larger than I had expected, a vast underground chamber that had been carved out of the earth by water and time, its walls lined with limestone that glistened wetly in the light of my lantern. The floor was covered in bones. Human bones and animal bones, piled high in some places and scattered thin in others, the remains of centuries of feeding, of hunting, of the terrible hunger that dwelt in this place. And there, at the center of the chamber, I saw it. The creature was not what I had expected. It was not a wolf or a man or any combination of the two. It was something else entirely, something that defied description, something that my mind struggled to process and my language struggled to name. It was huge, at least 12 feet tall when it uncoiled from its resting place, with a body that was vaguely humanoid but twisted, elongated, covered in scales that were black as the water above and eyes that burned with a cold yellow light. Its mouth was impossibly wide, filled with rows of teeth that curved backward like fishhooks, designed to hold prey and never let go. It looked at me with those burning eyes, and I felt the same thing that Thibodeau had described, that absolute certainty that I was going to die, that there was nothing I could do to stop it, that my life was measured in seconds, and those seconds were ticking away. But I did not die. The creature simply looked at me, studied me, as if it was curious about this small, fragile thing that had wandered into its domain. And then it spoke. The voice that came from its mouth was not a voice that should have been capable of human speech. It was a sound like stones grinding together, like water rushing through underground channels, like the earth itself groaning under the weight of millennia. "You are not like the others," it said. "You do not smell of fear alone. You smell of something else, something I have not tasted in a very long time." "What do you mean?" I asked, and I was proud that my voice did not shake, that I was able to speak at all. "You smell of faith," the creature said, "of belief, of that foolish human conviction that there is meaning in the universe, that there is purpose in your small and pointless lives. I have tasted it before, long ago, when humans first came to this place and brought their gods with them. It was delicious. It was intoxicating. It was the sweetest thing I have ever consumed." It moved toward me, its massive body flowing over the bones on the floor like water, like shadow, like something that did not obey the normal laws of physics. I backed away, my hand going to the crucifix at my neck, my mind racing through the prayers and incantations I had learned over the years. "Your symbols will not help you," the creature said, and there was amusement in its terrible voice. "Your words will not protect you. I am older than your gods, little human. I was old when the first of your kind crawled out of the trees and looked up at the stars. Your faith is nothing to me but seasoning." "Then why have you not killed me?" I asked. The creature paused, its burning eyes studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Because I am curious," it said. "Because you came here knowing what you would find, and you came anyway. Because you carry something with you, little hunter, something that I have not seen in a very long time." "What?" "Hope," the creature said. "You actually believe you can defeat me. You actually believe that your small and fragile life can make a difference, that your struggle has meaning, that your fight is worth fighting. It is foolish, it is absurd, it is utterly, completely, hilariously wrong. And yet you have not killed me," I said again. The creature was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke again, and its voice was different now, softer, almost thoughtful. "I will make you a deal, little hunter," it said. "I will stop taking the people of this swamp. I will sleep again for a time, and let the humans live their small and pointless lives in peace. In exchange, you will bring me something. What do you want?" "Stories," the creature said. "Tales of your hunts, your battles, your encounters with others like me. I have been asleep for so long, dreaming my dark dreams beneath the water and the mud. I want to know what is happening in the world above. I want to know who is winning the war." "The war?" The creature smiled, and that smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen, a gash of teeth and darkness that seemed to split its face in two. "The war between light and shadow," it said. "The war between order and chaos. The war that has been raging since the beginning of time and will rage until the end. I am too old to fight in it anymore, too tired to care who wins, but I still want to know. I still want to watch. I agreed to the deal. I do not know if I was right to do so. I do not know if there was another option, another way to protect the people of the bayou from the creature that lurked beneath their feet. All I know is that I have been returning to that cave once a year for the past 19 years, sitting in the darkness with the monster and telling it stories of my hunts, my battles, my encounters with others like it. And in exchange, the disappearances have stopped. The people of the bayou are safe, but the creature is still there. It is still waiting. And someday, I know, the deal will end, and it will wake up again, and it will be hungry. These are the kinds of stories I have to tell. These are the kinds of burdens I carry. Every demon hunter has them. Those cases that never quite ended. Those loose threads that hang in the darkness waiting to be pulled. We do not talk about them often, not even with each other. They are too heavy, too painful, too much like admissions of failure. But I am 60 years old now, and I am beginning to understand that I will not live forever. The cold I felt in that room in Kentucky, the cold I felt in that cave in Louisiana, the cold I have felt in 1,000 places over a lifetime of hunting has seeped into my bones and never left. My hands shake sometimes. My eyes are not as sharp as they used to be. My faith, that foolish human conviction that the creature in the bayou mocked, wavers more often than it once did. I need to tell these stories. I need someone to hear them, to remember them, to carry them forward when I am gone. Because the darkness does not care about individual hunters. It does not care about our lives, or our deaths, or our small and futile struggles. It simply waits. It simply watches. And when one hunter falls, another must rise to take their place. Let me tell you about the Moravec case. Let me tell you about the worst night of my life. It was the spring of 1984. And I was 44 years old. The call came from a priest in Pennsylvania, a man named Father Casimir, who served a small parish in the coal country north of Scranton. His voice on the telephone was calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had seen things that should have broken him and had somehow remained standing. "I have a family in my congregation," he said, "the Moravecs. Good people, devout people, the kind who come to Mass every Sunday and confession every week and never miss a holy day. 3 weeks ago, something happened to them. Something changed." "Tell me," I said. He told me about the Moravec family, about Yosef and his wife Katerina, about their 3 children, Marta and Pavel, and little Helena, who was only 5 years old. He told me about how they had moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a house that had been abandoned for decades, a house that the locals avoided and whispered about when they thought no one was listening. They were so proud of that house, Father Casimir said. They had saved for years to buy it, to have a place of their own, a place where they could raise their children and grow old together. They did not know. They could not have known. What happened? Father Casimir was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was no longer calm, no longer controlled. It was the voice of a man who had seen things that should not exist and was struggling to find words for them. The children started seeing things, he said. Shadows that moved on their own, faces in the windows at night, figures standing at the foot of their beds, watching them while they slept. Marta, the oldest, she is 12, she told me that a woman comes to her room every night. A woman with no eyes and no mouth. A woman who stands in the corner and just stares at her. Go on, I said. Then Joseph started hearing voices. Whispers in the walls, he said. Voices that told him things, terrible things. Things about his wife and his children and himself. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He started talking back to the voices, arguing with them, begging them to leave him alone. And Katerina? She is the worst, Father Casimir said. She has started speaking in tongues, old tongues, languages I do not recognize. She has started hurting herself, cutting symbols into her own skin. And she has started looking at her children in a way that no mother should look at her children, a way that makes me fear for their safety. Have you performed an exorcism? I tried, Father Casimir said, and his voice broke on the words. I tried and I failed. Whatever is in that house, whatever has taken hold of that family, it is beyond my ability to combat. That is why I am calling you, Mr. Thorne. That is why I need your help. I drove to Pennsylvania the next day, through mountains that still held patches of winter snow, through valleys that had been hollowed out by generations of mining, through towns that had been prosperous once and were now slowly dying. The Moravec farmhouse was exactly where Father Casimir had described, at the end of a dirt road that wound through fields gone fallow and forests that pressed close on either side. The house itself was old, older than the farmhouses around it, built in a style that suggested it dated back to the early 19th century. It was a large house, 2 stories with an attic above, constructed of gray stone that had been quarried from the hills nearby. The windows were dark, even though it was the middle of the day, covered by curtains that seemed to absorb the light rather than block it. The front door was painted red, but the paint had faded and peeled until it looked like old blood, dried and cracked in the sun. Father Casimir met me at the door. He was a small man with a round face and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering and never grown hard. He gripped my hand tightly when we shook, as if he was afraid that if he let go, I might disappear and leave him alone with whatever lurked inside. They are upstairs, he said. All of them. They have not come down in 3 days. I have been bringing them food and water, but they barely eat, barely drink. They just sit there, all 5 of them, staring at the walls and whispering to each other. What are they saying? Father Casimir shook his head. I do not know, he said. I cannot understand the language, but it is the same words, over and over, like a chant, like a prayer, like an invocation. I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, my bag of tools in one hand and my grandfather's crucifix in the other. The temperature dropped as I ascended, as it always does in places where the darkness has taken hold, until by the time I reached the top, I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with doors that stood closed on either side, and at the far end was the room where the Moravec family waited. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. They were arranged in a circle on the floor, all 5 of them, holding hands and swaying gently from side to side. Their eyes were open but unseeing, staring at something I could not see, something that existed in a place beyond the physical world. Their lips moved in unison, speaking words in a language I did not recognize, a language that sounded old, older than Latin, older than Greek, older than any tongue I had encountered in 44 years of hunting. At the center of their circle was a symbol, drawn on the floor in what looked like charcoal but smelled like blood. It was a complex symbol, a series of interlocking circles and lines that formed a pattern I had seen only once before, in a book that my father had forbidden me to read. a book that he had kept locked in a trunk in the basement of our family home. It was a summoning circle, but it was not designed to summon demons or spirits or any of the entities I had spent my career fighting. It was designed to summon something else, something far older and far more dangerous. I acted on instinct. I grabbed the nearest container of salt from my bag and threw it at the circle, breaking the pattern, disrupting the power that had been building in the room. The Moraveks stopped chanting immediately, their voices cutting off as if someone had flipped a switch. They turned to look at me, all 5 of them, with eyes that were no longer their own. "You should not have done that," they said in unison, and their voices were not the voices of a man and a woman and 3 children. They were one voice, ancient and cold and filled with a hunger that seemed to have no end. We were so close. We were almost home. "What are you?" I demanded. They smiled, all 5 of them, with the same wrong smile I would later see on the face of Ezra Whitmore in Kentucky. "We are the door," they said. "We are the threshold. We are the passage through which the old ones will return." I spent 6 days in that house, fighting the entity that had taken hold of the Moravek family. It was unlike any possession I had encountered before, a collective possession, 5 people bound together by whatever force had claimed them, their individual identities subsumed into a single terrible whole. I tried every technique I knew, every prayer, every ritual, every incantation. I burned sage and threw holy water and drew binding symbols on the walls. I spoke the names of powers both holy and terrible, invoking forces that I did not fully understand in the hope that they might prove stronger than whatever I was facing. Nothing worked. On the 5th night, I sat in the hallway outside the room where the Moraveks lay, exhausted beyond measure, my body aching and my mind reeling from days of constant battle. I had called for help, reaching out to other hunters I knew, other priests who specialized in cases like this, but they were all too far away, too busy with their own battles, too afraid of what I had described. I was alone. And then Father Casimir came to me, climbing the stairs with a weariness that matched my own, carrying something in his hands that glinted in the candlelight. "There is one thing we have not tried," he said, sitting down beside me on the cold floor. "One thing that my grandfather told me about, a story passed down through our family for generations. What is it?" He held up the object in his hands, and I saw that it was a box, small and rectangular, made of wood that had darkened with age. The surface was carved with symbols, the same kind of symbols I had seen throughout my career. Binding symbols, containment symbols, symbols meant to keep something locked away. "My grandfather was a priest in the old country," Father Casimir said, "before he came to America, before he served in this parish. He told me stories about what he had seen there, things that should not exist, things that had crawled up from the darkness to prey on the faithful. And he told me about this box. What is inside it?" Father Casimir opened the box, and I saw a small glass vial filled with a liquid that was dark and thick and somehow seemed to move on its own. "It is oil," he said. "Oil from a lamp that burned in a chapel in the Carpathian Mountains for 300 years, tended by monks who devoted their lives to holding back the darkness. When the chapel was destroyed during the war, my grandfather saved this vial. He told me that it was more precious than gold, more powerful than any prayer, more sacred than any relic. He told me that it was only to be used in the most desperate circumstances, when all other options had failed." "This is a desperate circumstance," I said. Father Casimir nodded. He handed me the vial, and I took it carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hand, the strange warmth that seemed to emanate from the glass. I went back into the room. The Moraveks had not moved. They lay where they had fallen after my last attempt to break the possession, their bodies arranged in a twisted parody of the circle they had formed before. Their eyes were closed now, but I could feel them watching me, feel the entity that controlled them tracking my every movement. I unstopped the vial and let a single drop of the oil fall onto my fingertip. Then I approached Josef Moravek, the father, the head of the family, the one who had been first to fall under the entity's control. "In the name of all that is holy," I said, touching my finger to his forehead and leaving a small mark of oil on his skin, "I command you to release this man." The reaction was immediate and violent. Yosef's body convulsed, his back arching off the floor, his mouth opening in a scream that seemed to go on forever, that seemed to contain within it all the pain and horror of centuries of human suffering. The entity that had possessed him was being forced out, torn away from its host by a power that it could not resist. I moved to Katerina. I touched her forehead with another drop of oil and spoke the words again. She screamed as her husband had screamed, her body twisting in ways that should have been impossible, her voice rising to a pitch that seemed to shatter the air itself. I moved to the children. Marta first, then Pavel, then little Helena, each of them screaming as the oil touched their skin, each of them convulsing as the entity was ripped from their flesh. When it was done, the room was silent. The Moravec family lay on the floor, unconscious but breathing, alive in a way they had not been alive for weeks. And I stood among them, the empty vial in my hand, feeling the weight of what I had done and what it had cost. Father Casimir appeared in the doorway. "Is it over?" he asked. I looked at the family on the floor, at the ordinary people who had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding and had somehow survived. I looked at the symbol on the floor, the summoning circle that had been broken and would need to be destroyed completely before anyone could use it again. I looked at the walls, still covered in the symbols I had drawn, the prayers I had spoken, the desperate measures I had taken to save 5 lives. "It is over for now," I said. "But the door they were trying to open is still there. The things they were trying to summon are still waiting. Someday, someone else will find this knowledge. Someday, someone else will try to finish what the Moravec started. What can we do?" Father Casimir asked the question that everyone asks, the question that has no good answer, the question that defines the life of every demon hunter who has ever lived. "We watch," I said. "We wait. We prepare. And when they come, we fight. That is all we can do. That is all we have ever been able to do." I left the Moravec house the next morning. Father Casimir stayed behind to care for the family, to help them recover from the ordeal they had suffered, to guide them through the difficult process of understanding what had happened and finding a way to live with that knowledge. I never saw any of them again, but I often think about them, especially little Helena, who was only 5 years old when she was possessed by something that had existed since before the dawn of time. I think about what she saw in those 3 weeks of darkness, what she heard, what she felt. I think about whether she ever truly recovered, whether she grew up to live a normal life, whether she was ever able to look at the world without seeing shadows in every corner. I hope she did. I hope she found peace. I hope the darkness that touched her so young did not mark her forever. But I know deep down that darkness always leaves marks. It always takes something. And no matter how hard we fight, no matter how much we sacrifice, we never quite get back what we have lost. Let me tell you one more story. Let me tell you about the most recent case I have worked, the case that brought me back to where I started, to that frozen road in Kentucky on the last night of the year. It was November of 1997, 2 months before my encounter with Balzacar in the Whitmore farmstead. I received a letter from a woman named Sophronia Ashby, who lived in a small town in the hills of West Virginia. Her handwriting was elegant but shaky, the letters formed with care but wavering as if the hand that held the pen was trembling. "I am dying," she wrote. "I have cancer, and the doctors say I have only a few months left. But that is not why I am writing to you, Mr. Thorne. I am writing because I have something to confess, something I have been carrying for 60 years, something I cannot take to my grave. When I was 12 years old, I made a deal with something in the woods behind my family's farm. Something old, something hungry, something that promised me things it should not have promised and took things it should not have taken. I have lived my whole life in its shadow, doing what it asked, giving it what it wanted, and now I am dying, and I am afraid, Mr. Thorne. I am afraid of what will happen when I am gone. I am afraid of what I have set in motion. Please come. Please help me undo what I have done, before it is too late." I drove to West Virginia on a gray November morning, through mountains that were already bare, stripped of their autumn colors by cold winds that seemed to blow from somewhere beyond this world. The town where Sophronia Ashby lived was called Ashby Hollow, named for her family, who had settled there more than 200 years ago. It was a small place, barely a village, a collection of houses and a general store and a church with a steeple that seemed to lean slightly to one side. Sophronia's house was the largest in town, a Victorian mansion that had been built in the late 19th century and had not been well maintained since. The paint was peeling, the shutters were hanging loose, and the front porch sagged in the middle as if it was tired of holding up the weight of the years. But the garden was immaculate, rows of flowers and herbs that should not have been blooming in November, but were, their colors bright against the gray landscape. She met me at the door, a small woman in her 70s with white hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She was thin, painfully thin, the cancer already eating away at her body, but her voice was strong and her gaze was steady. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I was not sure you would." "I always come," I replied. "That is what I do." She led me into the house, through rooms that were filled with antiques and old furniture, past walls covered in photographs that told the story of a family that had been powerful once and had slowly faded away. The air inside was heavy with the smell of dust and old wood and something else, something that reminded me of the bayou in Louisiana, that same sense of age and decay and things lurking just beyond the edge of perception. We sat in her parlor, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was coming to an end, and she told me her story. It began in the summer of 1937, when she was 12 years old. Her family was wealthy then, the richest in the valley, owners of coal mines and timber lands and farms that stretched for miles in every direction. But wealth had not brought happiness. Her father was a cruel man, a drunk who beat her mother and terrorized his children. Her mother was a shadow of a woman, broken by years of abuse, unable to protect her children from her husband's rage. Sophronia had run away one night, fleeing into the woods behind the farm after her father had beaten her for some imagined offense. She had run without knowing where she was going, without caring, wanting only to escape, to get away from the pain and the fear and the hopelessness of her life. And in the woods, she had found something. It was not a demon, she said, her voice soft and distant, lost in the memory of that long-ago night. It was not a devil or a spirit or any of the things you have spent your life fighting. It was something else, something older, something that had been there since before humans came to these mountains, since before the mountains themselves rose from the earth. "What did it look like?" I asked. She shook her head. "I cannot describe it," she said. "Every time I try, the words slip away. It was like trying to describe a color that does not exist, a shape that has no dimensions. All I remember is the feeling it gave me, the sense of being in the presence of something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to everything I thought I knew about the world." "What did it offer you?" "Everything," she said. "It offered me everything. It offered to take away my father, to remove him from my life as if he had never existed. It offered me power, the power to protect myself and my family, the power to never be afraid again. It offered me a life free from pain, free from fear, free from all the things that had made my childhood a living hell. And what did it ask in return?" Sophronia was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Service," she said. "It asked for my service, not forever, just until I died. It asked me to be its eyes and ears in the world of humans, to do its bidding when it called, to feed it when it hungered. What does it hunger for?" She looked at me with eyes that had seen things no human being should see. "Souls," she said. "It hungers for souls, not the way demons do, not to consume them or corrupt them. It hungers for them the way a collector hungers for rare objects. It wants to possess them, to keep them, to add them to its collection." "How many?" I asked, and my voice was harder than I intended. 37, she said. 37 souls over 60 years. Men and women and children, people who would not be missed, people who had no one to mourn them. I led them to it, and it took them, and they are still there, still trapped in whatever place it keeps them, still aware, still suffering. "You want me to free them?" I said. "I want you to try," she replied. "I do not know if it is possible. I do not know if anything can free them now. But I cannot die with this weight on my soul. I cannot face whatever waits for me on the other side knowing what I have done. Please, Mr. Thorne, please at least try." I agreed. I agreed, because that is what I do, because I cannot turn away from suffering, because every soul matters, even souls that have been lost for 60 years. I agreed, even though I knew that what I was about to face was unlike anything I had faced before, that the entity in those woods was older and more powerful than any demon or devil, that I might well be walking to my death. Sophronia led me to the edge of the forest that night, to a path that wound between ancient trees and over mossy stones, deeper and deeper into the darkness. She walked with difficulty, her cancer-weakened body struggling with the terrain, but she refused to stop, refused to let me go on alone. "It knows we are coming," she said as we walked. "It has always known. It has been waiting for this moment since the day I made my deal with it. It knew, even then, that someday I would try to undo what I had done. It has been looking forward to this for 60 years. Why? Because it enjoys the game," she said. "It enjoys watching us struggle, watching us hope, watching us fail. It is the only entertainment it has, the only thing that breaks the monotony of its endless existence." We reached a clearing at the center of the forest, a place where no trees grew and no grass sprouted, a circle of bare earth surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to lean inward like spectators at an arena. The moon was full above us, casting silver light across the clearing, and in that light I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were people standing at the edge of the clearing, dozens of them, men and women and children, their faces pale and their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent screams that had lasted for decades. They were the souls that Sophronia had fed to the entity, the 37 people who had been taken, and they were still here, still trapped, still aware of what had happened to them. And behind them, in the shadow of the trees, I saw the entity itself. Sophronia was right. I could not describe it. I could not process it. My mind simply refused to accept what my eyes were showing it, refused to make sense of the shape and the size and the terrible presence of the thing that lurked in the darkness. All I knew was that it was there, that it was watching, that it was ancient beyond measure and powerful beyond imagining. "Ezekiel Thorne," the entity said, and its voice was not a voice at all, but a vibration in the air, a trembling in the earth, a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I have heard of you, the little hunter who fights the shadows, the little man who thinks he can make a difference. I have come to free these souls," I said, and I was amazed that my voice did not shake, that I was able to speak at all in the presence of something so vast and so terrible. The entity laughed, and the trees shook with the sound of it, and the earth trembled, and the souls at the edge of the clearing screamed silently in their eternal agony. "Free them?" the entity repeated. "You cannot free them. They are mine. They have been mine since the moment they were given to me, and they will be mine until the end of time. Nothing you can do will change that. No prayer, no ritual, no act of faith or courage or desperation." "Then why did you let me come here?" I demanded. "Why did you let Sophronia bring me to this place?" "Because I wanted to see you," the entity said. "Because I wanted to look upon the face of one who has devoted his life to fighting my kind, to standing against the darkness, to holding back the tide. And now that I have seen you, Ezekiel Thorne, I am satisfied. You are even smaller than I imagined, even more fragile, even more hopelessly, hilariously insignificant. I did not try to fight it. I did not try to bind it or banish it or any of the other things I had done throughout my career. I knew, in that moment, that such efforts would be utterly futile, that I was facing something that existed on a level so far beyond my understanding that my tools and techniques were like toys, like children's games, like meaningless gestures in the face of an infinite void. But I did not give up. I refused to give up. "These souls do not belong to you," I said. "They belong to themselves. They belong to whatever created them, whatever force or power or God brought them into being. And no matter how old you are, no matter how powerful, you have no right to keep them." The entity was silent for a long moment. The souls at the edge of the clearing stopped their silent screaming and turned to look at me, and in their empty eyes I saw something that might have been hope. "You believe that," the entity said finally. "You actually believe that. You stand before me, a being older than your species and more powerful than anything you have ever encountered, and you believe that your words have meaning, that your principles have weight, that your faith has power. I do, I said. The entity laughed again, but there was something different in the sound this time. Something that might have been respect, or might have been amusement, or might have been both. Very well, Ezekiel Thorne, it said. I will make you a deal. What kind of deal? I will release these souls, the entity said. I will let them go. Let them pass on to whatever fate awaits them. But in exchange, you must give me something. What? A story, the entity said. Your story. The story of your life, from beginning to end. Every hunt, every battle, every victory, and every defeat. Every moment of hope and every moment of despair. Everything you have seen and done and felt and feared. I want it all. I hesitated. I knew what the entity was asking for. It was asking for my memories, my experiences, my very identity. It was asking me to give up everything that made me who I was. Everything that had shaped me over 60 years of life and 43 years of hunting. But I also knew what was at stake. 37 souls, trapped for decades, suffering for decades, waiting for someone to set them free. What happens to me if I agree? I asked. You will live, the entity said. You will continue your work, hunting demons and fighting shadows, but you will not remember any of it. You will not remember the cases you have worked or the people you have saved or the enemies you have faced. You will wake up tomorrow morning, and your mind will be a blank slate, ready to be filled with new experiences, new memories, new stories. And these souls, they will be free, the entity said. They will move on to whatever awaits them. They will be at peace. I looked at the souls standing at the edge of the clearing, at the men and women and children who had been trapped for so long, suffering for so long. I looked at Sophronia, who had fallen to her knees beside me, her face wet with tears, her body shaking with sobs, and I made my choice. I agree, I said. The entity moved, and the world changed. I felt something vast and ancient and utterly alien reach into my mind and begin to pull, to extract, to harvest the memories and experiences that made up who I was. I felt my past slipping away, case by case, year by year, moment by moment. I felt myself becoming less, becoming smaller, becoming nothing but a vessel waiting to be filled. But before the last memory faded, before the final piece of my identity was taken, I saw the souls at the edge of the clearing begin to change. Their empty eyes filled with life. Their silent screams became sounds of joy, of release, of freedom. They turned away from the entity and walked into the light of the moon, walking toward whatever peace awaited them on the other side. And then everything went dark. I woke up the next morning in a motel room I did not recognize, in a town I did not know, with a bag full of tools I did not remember acquiring. There was a letter on the pillow beside my head, written in my own handwriting, telling me who I was and what I did and why. My name is Ezekiel Thorne, the letter said. I am a demon hunter. I have been doing this work for many years, although I do not remember how many. I have faced things that should not exist and done things that should not be possible. I have saved lives and lost lives and learned lessons that I cannot recall, but that have shaped me nonetheless. This is my life. This is my purpose. This is what I do. The letter did not explain how I had lost my memories. It did not tell me about the deal I had made, or the souls I had freed, or the entity in the woods of West Virginia. It simply told me who I was and pointed me toward my next case. I followed the instructions. I did the work. I hunted demons and fought shadows and saved lives, building new memories to replace the ones I had lost. But sometimes, late at night, when the darkness presses close and the silence seems to hold its breath, I feel something stirring in the depths of my mind. I feel echoes of experiences I do not remember, whispers of stories I cannot tell. I feel the weight of 43 years of hunting. 43 years of sacrifice, 43 years of standing against the darkness, even though I cannot recall a single specific moment of any of it. And I wonder what I gave up. I wonder what I lost. I wonder who I was before the entity took my memories, and what I might have been if I had made a different choice. But I do not regret. I cannot regret because I do not remember what I gave up. All I know is that I did something important, something meaningful, something that mattered. All I know is that somewhere, 37 souls found peace because of a choice I made. That is enough. That has to be enough. Now I am 60 years old, and I am still hunting, still fighting, still standing against the darkness that never stops coming. I have new memories now. 12 years of cases and battles and victories and defeats that have replaced the ones I lost. I know the taste of fear and the weight of sacrifice and the cold certainty that comes from facing things that should not exist. And I have one more story to tell. One more case that haunts me, that keeps me awake at night, that refuses to let me rest. It happened 3 weeks after my encounter with Balzacar in the Whitmore farmstead. I was still recovering from that battle, still feeling the cold that had seeped into my bones, still hearing the whisper of the entity's promise to return. I should have been resting, recovering, preparing for whatever came next. But the darkness does not wait for us to be ready. It does not care about our health or our schedules or our peace of mind. It simply comes, relentlessly, inevitably, and we must face it whether we are prepared or not. The call came from a sheriff in Tennessee, a man named Elijah Blackwood, who served a county in the mountains east of Knoxville. His voice was rough and tired, the voice of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. "We have a situation out here," he said. "Something I cannot explain, something that does not make any sense. I heard your name from a friend of a friend, and I am hoping you can help." "Tell me what is happening," I said. He told me about the Caldwell mine, an abandoned coal mine in the mountains that had been closed for 50 years after a cave-in killed 47 miners. The mine had been sealed, the entrance bricked up, the land above it fenced off and marked with warning signs. No one had been inside for half a century. But 3 weeks ago, the bricks had been removed, the entrance was open, and people had started going in. "They call it the pilgrimage," Sheriff Blackwood said. "That is what they call it. Folks from all over the county, sometimes from other counties too, they show up at the mine entrance, and they walk in like they are being called, like something inside is summoning them. They go in, and they do not come back." "How many?" 23 so far," Sheriff Blackwood said. 23 people who walked into that mine and never came out. Men and women, young and old, rich and poor. No pattern I can see, no connection between them. Just ordinary folks who suddenly get this look in their eyes and start walking toward the mine like they have no choice, like they have to go, like something is pulling them. "What have you done about it?" "I have tried everything," he said. "I sent deputies in after them. The deputies did not come back. I sealed the entrance again, boarded it up, posted guards. The people tore the boards down in the middle of the night and walked in anyway. I tried to stop them physically, to restrain them, but they fought like wild animals, like they would rather die than not go into that mine, and no one who has gone in has come out." "No one," Sheriff Blackwood said. "Not one single person." I drove to Tennessee the next day, through mountains that still held the last stubborn snows of winter, past towns that were small and quiet and utterly ordinary. The county where the Caldwell mine was located seemed no different from any other, just another patch of rural America where people lived their lives and raised their families and tried to get by. But there was something wrong in that county. I could feel it the moment I crossed the border, a wrongness that seemed to hang in the air like a weight, pressing down on everything and everyone. The people I passed on the road looked at me with hollow eyes. The houses I drove past seemed to lean slightly toward the mountains, as if they were being pulled by some invisible force. The sky was gray and overcast, the clouds low and heavy, as if the sun itself was reluctant to shine on this place. Sheriff Blackwood met me at the edge of town, a large man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen things he would never speak about. He shook my hand firmly and led me to his truck, and together we drove into the mountains toward the mine. "It started 3 weeks ago," he said as we drove. "The same night you were fighting whatever you were fighting in Kentucky." I looked it up afterward. The last night of the year, the stroke of midnight, the turn from old to new. That is when it began. That is when the first person walked into the mine. "What do you think it means?" I asked. "I think something woke up," Sheriff Blackwood said. "Something that has been sleeping for a long time, maybe since the mine closed, maybe since before that. Something that has been waiting for the right moment to call out, to summon, to feed." We reached the mine as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountainside. The entrance was exactly as he had described, a dark opening in the rock face surrounded by the remains of wooden supports and rusting equipment. There were people gathered around it, maybe a dozen of them, standing in a loose semicircle and staring into the darkness as if they were waiting for something. "They have been like this for hours," Sheriff Blackwood said. "Just standing there, staring. They will not respond when you talk to them. They will not move when you try to lead them away. They just stand there and wait." "Wait for what?" I do not know, he said. But when it calls them, when they hear whatever it is they are listening for, they will walk in. One by one, they will walk into that darkness, and they will not come back. I approached the entrance, feeling the cold air that emanated from within, smelling the stale dust and old rock and something else, something that reminded me of the entity in the bayou, that same sense of age and hunger and patient waiting. The people standing around me did not react to my presence. They just stared into the darkness, their eyes wide and empty, their faces slack. I reached out and touched the arm of the nearest person, a middle-aged woman with gray-streaked hair. Her skin was cold, far too cold for a living person, and when I looked into her eyes, I saw nothing. No recognition, no awareness, no soul. They are already gone, I said to Sheriff Blackwood. Whatever is in that mine, it has already taken them. Their bodies are still here, but the people they were, the souls that made them who they were, are gone. Can you bring them back? I do not know, I said. I do not even know what I am dealing with yet. I asked Sheriff Blackwood to wait for me at the entrance. I asked him to give me until dawn. If I was not back by then, I told him, he should leave this place and never come back. He should find a way to seal the mine permanently, to bury it under tons of rock and concrete and steel, to make it impossible for anyone to ever enter again. He tried to argue. He tried to insist on coming with me, but I was firm, and eventually he agreed. I walked into the darkness alone. The mine shaft descended into the earth at a gentle angle, the floor smooth and worn by generations of miners who had walked this path every day, carrying their tools and their hopes and their fears into the black belly of the mountain. The walls were rough-hewn rock, supported by wooden beams that had been here for a century and were slowly rotting away. The air grew colder as I descended, and the silence grew deeper, until the only sound was my own footsteps echoing off the stone. I walked for what felt like hours. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching off into side passages that led to places I could not see, places I did not want to see. I followed the main shaft, the widest path, the one that seemed to lead most directly into the heart of the mountain. And then I reached the cavern. It was vast, larger than anything I had expected, a natural chamber that the miners must have broken into by accident, a space that had been hidden beneath the earth since the world was young. The ceiling stretched so high that my lantern could not reach it, and the walls disappeared into shadows that seemed to move and shift as I watched. At the center of the cavern was a pit, a hole in the floor that descended into a darkness so absolute that it seemed to swallow light itself. And around that pit, arranged in neat rows, were people. Hundreds of people, thousands perhaps, men and women and children, all of them standing perfectly still, all of them staring into the pit with eyes that were empty and hollow and dead. These were the people who had been taken, I realized, not just from the last 3 weeks, but from decades, from centuries perhaps. All the people who had ever answered the call of whatever lurked in this place, all gathered here, all waiting. Ezekiel Thorne. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the ceiling and the pit itself, a voice that was ancient and cold and utterly without mercy. I have been waiting for you. I did not respond. I did not know what to say. You think you have come here to save these people? The voice continued. You think you have come here to fight me, to banish me, to send me back to whatever pit I crawled out of. But you are wrong, Ezekiel Thorne. You have not come here to save anyone. You have come here because I called you. You have come here because I wanted you to come. Why? Because you interest me, the voice said. Because you are different from the others. They come because they have no choice, because I reach into their minds and pull them toward me like a child pulling a string. But you came by choice. You walked into this darkness knowing what you would find, knowing that you might not walk out again. You came because you believe you can make a difference, that your small and fragile life has meaning, that your struggle matters. It does matter, I said. The voice laughed, and the sound filled the cavern, echoing off the walls and the ceiling, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. Your faith is admirable, it said. Your courage is remarkable. But you are wrong. Nothing matters. Nothing has ever mattered. The universe is vast and cold and empty, and your species is a momentary flicker of light in an eternal darkness. I have watched civilizations rise and fall. I have seen gods born and killed. I have existed since before time began, and will exist long after time ends. And in all that existence, nothing I have ever witnessed has mattered. Then why do you want these people? I demanded. If nothing matters, why do you collect them? Why do you call them to you? Because they are beautiful, the voice said, and there was something different in its tone now. Something that might have been longing, or might have been hunger, or might have been love. Their lives are so short, so fragile, so utterly without significance, and yet they love, they hope, they dream. They struggle against the darkness even though they know they cannot win. They are beautiful in their foolishness, beautiful in their defiance, beautiful in their absolute refusal to accept the truth of their insignificance. I collect them the way a child collects butterflies, the voice continued. I preserve them the way a museum preserves artifacts. I keep them here, in this place between life and death, where they can exist forever, where their small and precious lights can burn eternally. That is not life, I said. That is imprisonment. That is suffering. That is torture. It is mercy, the voice replied. It is the only mercy I can offer in a universe that has none. Out there, in the world you come from, they would grow old and sick and die. Their lights snuffed out, their memories forgotten, their existence reduced to nothing. Here, they live forever. Here, they matter forever. Here, they are preserved for all eternity. I looked at the thousands of people standing around the pit, their empty eyes staring into the darkness below. I looked at their faces, frozen in expressions that might have been peace, or might have been agony, or might have been something beyond human understanding, and I made my choice. They are not yours to keep, I said. They belong to themselves. They belong to the world they came from, and I will not let you take any more of them. The voice laughed again, but there was less humor in it this time, more anger. You cannot stop me, it said. You are one small man with your small tools and your small faith. I am eternal. I am infinite. I am the darkness between the stars and the silence between heartbeats and the cold at the end of all things. Maybe, I said. But I am going to try anyway. I did not defeat the entity in the Caldwell mine. I did not banish it or bind it or destroy it. Such things were beyond my power, beyond the power of any human being. But I did something. I do not fully understand what I did or how I did it. I only know that I stood at the edge of that pit and spoke every prayer I knew, in every language I had learned, invoking every power I had ever called upon in 43 years of hunting. I threw holy water into the darkness and watched it sizzle and steam. I held up my grandfather's crucifix and felt the entity recoil. I spoke the names of things I barely believed in and felt them answer, and slowly, impossibly, the people around the pit began to wake up. They blinked, they stirred, they looked around at the darkness they had been standing in for decades, for centuries perhaps, and they began to scream. They screamed and they ran, fleeing toward the tunnel that led to the surface, fleeing toward the light they had almost forgotten existed. I stood at the edge of the pit and watched them go. I stood there until the last of them had escaped, until the cavern was empty except for me and the darkness below. Then the voice spoke again, and it was different now, softer, almost weary. You have taken them from me, it said. You have taken my collection, my treasures, my beautiful fragile lights. I have been gathering them for 10,000 years, and you have taken them all in a single night. Yes, I said. Why? The voice asked. What did it matter? They were content here. They were safe here. They would have existed forever, preserved in perfect stillness. Now they will go back to their world and grow old and die and be forgotten, just like all the others, because it was their choice to make, I said. Not yours, not mine. Theirs. The voice was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke again. You are a strange creature, Ezekiel Thorne, it said. You believe in things that do not exist. You fight for causes that cannot be won. You sacrifice yourself for people who will never know your name. I do, I said. Why? I thought about the question. I thought about all the years I had spent hunting demons and fighting shadows, about all the people I had saved and all the people I had lost, about all the darkness I had faced and all the light I had found. Because someone has to, I said finally. Because if no one stands against the darkness wins. And maybe that is inevitable. Maybe the universe really is vast and cold and empty, and nothing really matters in the end. But I am not going to be the one who gives up. I am not going to be the one who stops fighting. I am going to keep standing against the darkness until I cannot stand anymore. And when I fall, someone else will take my place. And when they fall, someone else will take theirs. That is what it means to be human. That is what makes us beautiful. The voice was silent. The darkness in the pit seemed to pulse once, twice, 3 times, like a heartbeat, like a breath, like something thinking. Then it spoke again. Go, it said. Leave this place and never return. Take your people and your faith and your beautiful foolish defiance. But know this, Ezekiel Thorne, I am still here. I will always be here. And when the time comes when you finally grow old and weak and tired, when you cannot stand against the darkness any longer, I will be waiting, and you will be the most beautiful light in my collection. I turned and walked away. I walked up through the tunnels and out into the cold mountain air, where the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Sheriff Blackwood was waiting for me, surrounded by hundreds of confused and frightened people, the souls I had freed from the pit. He looked at me with eyes full of questions, but I had no answers for him. I drove away from that place and did not look back. That was 3 weeks ago. I am 60 years old now, and I am tired. I can feel the weariness in my bones, the exhaustion of a lifetime spent fighting battles that can never be won. I can hear the whispers of all the entities I have faced over the years, all the darkness I have touched and been touched by. I know that someday soon, my body will fail me, and my strength will fade, and I will not be able to fight anymore. But until that day comes, I will keep hunting. I will keep standing against the darkness. I will keep telling my stories to anyone who will listen, so that when I am gone, someone will remember, someone will know, because that is what demon hunters do. That is who we are. We are the ones who face the darkness, so others do not have to. We are the ones who carry the weight of impossible knowledge so others can live in blissful ignorance. We are the ones who sacrifice everything, again and again, because someone has to. I have some stories to tell you. I have told you some of them tonight. But there are more, always more, endless stories of endless darkness and the endless struggle against it. If you ever find yourself in a place where the shadows seem too deep, where the silence seems too heavy, where something whispers your name from the darkness and you feel a pull towards something you cannot see, remember what I have told you. Remember that there are things in this world that should not exist but do. Remember that there are people who spend their lives fighting those things. And remember that no matter how dark the night becomes, dawn always comes eventually, unless it does not. Unless the darkness finally wins, finally swallows everything, finally claims all the beautiful, fragile lights it has been collecting for 10,000 years. Unless the things that whisper in the shadows finally get what they want. I am Ezekiel Thorne, and I hunt demons for a living. I have been doing this for 43 years, and I will keep doing it until I cannot do it anymore. But I am getting old. My hands shake, my eyes dim. My faith wavers, and in the darkness, in the places where light has never reached, the things I have spent my life fighting are starting to smile. They know what I know. They know that I am running out of time, and they are patient. They have always been patient. They will wait for me to fall, and then they will be there, waiting to catch me. I do not know how much longer I have. I do not know how many more cases I will work, how many more demons I will face, how many more souls I will save or fail to save. All I know is that the darkness is getting closer, and I am getting slower, and someday soon, the race will end. When it does, when I finally fall, I hope someone will be there to take my place. I hope someone will pick up my bag and my grandfather's crucifix and continue the work I started. I hope that the light I have spent my life protecting will continue to burn, even after mine has gone out. Because that is all any of us can hope for. That is all any of us can do. Keep the light burning, keep fighting the darkness, and never, ever stop believing that it matters. Because it does matter. It has to matter. Otherwise, what is the point? Outside my window right now, as I write these words, the night is dark and still. The stars are hidden behind clouds, and the moon is nowhere to be seen. The wind has fallen silent, and the world seems to be holding its breath, waiting for something. I do not know what it is waiting for. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, or what darkness I will face next. All I know is that when the call comes, when someone reaches out to me because they have seen something that should not exist, I will answer. I will always answer, because I am Ezekiel Thorne, and this is what I do. This is who I am, And until the very end, until the last breath leaves my body and the last light fades from my eyes, I will keep hunting the demons. I will keep fighting the shadows. I will keep standing against the darkness. And if you ever need me, if you ever find yourself facing something that should not exist, something that defies explanation, something that fills you with a fear so deep it seems to touch your very soul, you know where to find me. Just follow the darkness. I will be there, somewhere in the depths, fighting as I have always fought, fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves, fighting for a world that does not know the war being waged on its behalf, fighting until the end, whatever that end may be. The candle on my desk is guttering now, the flame flickering in a breeze that comes from nowhere, that should not exist in a closed room with all windows shut tight. The shadows in the corners of my study seem deeper than they were a moment ago, darker, more alive. Something is watching me. Something has been watching me for a long time. I can feel it in the cold that settles into my bones, no matter how many blankets I pile on. I can hear it in the whispers that echo at the edge of my hearing when the night grows quiet. I can see it in the faces that appear in my dreams, the faces of all the entities I have faced over the years, all gathered together, all smiling that wrong smile. They are waiting for me. They have been waiting for 60 years, patient as only ancient things can be patient, knowing that eventually, inevitably, I will come to them. I signed the papers in a windowless office in Seattle, a short drive from the life I was about to lose. The man across from me, Thomas, never smiled as he slid the folder over the metal desk, his eyes cold and still, like a winter morning in Olympic National Forest. "You understand the nature of the work," he said, not as a question. I understood desperation, unpaid bills, and a future slipping away. My daughter Lily lived states away, and the debt kept growing like fog rolling through old-growth trees. I signed my name, Ethan Walker. The job was simple, Thomas said. Not easy, just clear. People were disappearing in America's most famous forests. Not the ones who wandered off trails drunk or underprepared, Thomas continued, his voice flat and clinical. The other ones. The ones who vanished from locked tents in the middle of the night. The ones whose clothes were found folded neatly on rocks miles from any path. The ones the park rangers stopped talking about after the first 48 hours, because talking about them made the questions worse than the silence. "We are a rapid response team," Thomas explained. "Department of the Interior officially, off the books actually. You will work with a small unit. Former military mostly. People who can handle unusual circumstances without asking too many questions." The pay was more than I had made in 3 years combined. The signing bonus alone cleared my debts and left enough for 6 months of child support payments. The work would take me away from Seattle, away from the empty apartment where I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had fallen apart so completely. Away sounded perfect. Away sounded like salvation. I met the team in Washington State 4 days later at a ranger station on the edge of Olympic National Forest. The forest stretched before us like something from an ancient dream, towering Sitka spruce and western red cedar rising into mist that clung to the canopy like a living thing. The Hoh Rainforest section was our destination, one of the wettest places in the continental United States, where moss covered everything and the air itself felt heavy with secrets. Beautiful until you learned about the 5 hikers who had disappeared there in the past 3 weeks. Our team assembled in a briefing room that smelled of coffee and old wood. 6 of us, including me. There was Aiden, a broad-shouldered former Army Ranger who spoke in short, precise sentences and checked his weapons with the focus of someone who had seen too much combat to ever fully relax. Marcus handled technical equipment, radios, GPS units, thermal imaging cameras, and satellite phones. He was thin and nervous, always adjusting something, always worried about signal strength and battery life. There was Elena, our medic, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had a calm, steady presence that made you believe everything would be okay, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Rachel had been doing this work for 4 years and had the kind of scars on her arms and neck that made you stop asking questions about what she had encountered. And finally, there was David, our team leader, a gray-haired man in his late 50s, who introduced himself by saying, "You will see things that do not make sense, and your job is to do the job anyway." The briefing was short and disturbing. 5 missing persons, David said, pointing at a map covered in red circles. 2 experienced backpackers from Portland, a nature photographer from San Francisco, a retired Forest Service employee who knew these woods better than anyone alive, and a young woman named Catherine who had been researching old-growth ecosystems for her graduate thesis. Last known positions form a rough pattern about 6 miles into the Hoh rainforest. No distress calls, no signs of struggle at any campsite. Just absence. Just emptiness where people used to be. Aidan studied the map with narrowed eyes. "Any connection between the victims?" he asked. David shook his head. "Different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being in the forest. The only common factor is the location and the manner of disappearance. They all vanished without a trace, without a sound, without any logical explanation." "Local indigenous peoples have stories about these woods," David continued. "The Quinault and Quileute tribes speak of spirits that dwell in the oldest parts of the forest. Hungry spirits that wear the faces of animals and call to travelers in voices that sound almost human. They say the forest itself is alive in ways we do not understand, that it watches and waits and sometimes takes." Rachel spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "I have worked cases in 6 different forests across the country. The folklore is always different, but the pattern is always the same. People walk into the wilderness and something calls to them. Something that knows what they want, what they fear, what keeps them awake at night. And they follow that call until they disappear." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "So what are we actually dealing with here?" he asked. "A serial killer using the forest as cover? Some kind of predator? Mass hysteria causing people to wander off?" David looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to offer comfortable answers. "We do not know," he said simply. "That is the honest truth. We have theories and folklore and patterns, but we do not have answers. What we have is a job to do. We go in, we track, we document, and when possible we bring people back alive." He paused. "Sometimes we succeed. Most times we find nothing at all. And occasionally we find things that make us wish we had found nothing." He looked at me specifically. "You believe in any of this, Ethan? Ghosts, spirits, monsters in the woods?" I thought about my daughter Lily, about her voice on the phone last week asking when I could visit, about the promises I had broken and the ones I was trying to keep. I thought about the empty bank account and the pile of bills and the crushing weight of failure that had brought me to this windowless room to sign papers for a job I did not understand. "I believe in the paycheck," I said. David nodded slowly. "Good enough for now. Gear up. We move in 30 minutes. The forest swallowed us whole the moment we stepped off the maintained trail. Olympic National Forest is unlike any other place in America. The Hoh rainforest receives over 12 feet of rainfall annually, creating an ecosystem so dense and green that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy. Everything drips with moisture. Moss hangs from branches like curtains. Ferns grow taller than a person. The ground is soft and spongy with centuries of decomposed vegetation. Sound travels strangely here, muffled and distorted, making distances impossible to judge. We moved in single file with Aidan on point and David bringing up the rear. The forest closed around us like a living thing. Within an hour, the ranger station felt like it belonged to another world, another lifetime. Here there was only the endless green, the constant dripping of water, the occasional call of a bird that fell silent as we approached. I noticed the silence first. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became until even our footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the moss and the mist. Rachel moved beside me, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "You feel it?" she asked quietly. I nodded. The watching. It had started about half a mile back, a sensation like eyes tracking our movement from every direction, not threatening exactly, just aware. The forest knew we were here. Something in the forest knew we were here. And it was curious. We found the first campsite just before noon. 2 tents still zipped shut against the perpetual moisture. Gear hung properly in waterproof bags suspended from branches. A camp stove cold but clean beneath a makeshift rain shelter. 2 backpacks containing wallets, phones, and car keys. Everything a person would need to survive in the wilderness, left behind as if the owners had simply decided to walk away from their lives. Elena examined the scene with professional detachment. They left on foot, she said, crouching near the tent entrance. Sometime in the middle of the night, based on the condensation patterns. Walked out with nothing. No shoes, no jackets, no supplies. David moved to the edge of the campsite where the vegetation had been disturbed. Direction, he asked. Elena pointed deeper into the forest, away from any trail. Single file, she said. Both of them walking the exact same path, like they were following something, or being led. We followed the trail they had left behind. 2 sets of bare footprints pressed into the soft earth, so clear they might have been made that morning. The prints showed no hesitation, no stumbling, no signs that the people making them had been afraid or confused. They walked with purpose, with certainty, deeper and deeper into a forest that grew older and stranger with every step. That is when I started noticing the things that made my skin crawl. The birds had stopped singing entirely. The constant drip of water from the canopy had faded to silence. Even the air felt different, thicker, harder to breathe, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees around us were massive, ancient giants that had been growing since before Columbus landed, their trunks wider than cars, their branches disappearing into the mist above. And carved into those trunks, at irregular intervals, I saw symbols. Not natural markings. These were deliberate, carved by human hands, though they looked old, very old. Spirals and circles, stick figures with too many limbs, animals that did not quite look like any animal I could name. Marcus photographed everything, his camera clicking in the silence like a heartbeat. These carvings go back centuries, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Some of them might be indigenous, but others I have never seen anything like them. Rachel had stopped ahead of us, her body rigid, her hand raised in a signal to halt. David moved up beside her, and I heard him inhale sharply. "What is it?" I asked, but no one answered. I had to push past Aiden to see what had stopped them, and when I did, I understood why they had fallen silent. The footprints we had been following led to a clearing, a perfect circle of open space in the midst of the ancient forest. The trees around the perimeter had been stripped of bark in long vertical gouges that stretched 20 feet up their trunks, too high for any bear, too precise for any natural occurrence. And in the center of the clearing, arranged in a spiral pattern that turned my stomach, were shoes, dozens of pairs, hiking boots and sandals and running shoes and work boots. Some looked new, barely worn. Others were so old they were rotting into the earth, consumed by moss and decay. At the center of the spiral, where a footprint might mark the final step, the ground was scorched black. "No one touches anything," David ordered, his voice tight with tension. "Ethan, Aiden, perimeter watch. Everyone else, document and prepare to extract. We have 10 minutes. But Aiden had already moved to the far side of the clearing, his rifle raised, staring at something I could not see from my position. "David," he called out, his voice flat and controlled in the way that combat veterans speak when they are trying not to show fear. "You need to see this." Carved into the trunk of the largest tree in the clearing, the letters rough but unmistakable, was a message. "They are still hungry." The date below it was yesterday. We lost the trail in Olympic. The 2 backpackers from Portland never turned up, not in the forest, not anywhere. Their car sat in the trailhead parking lot for 3 weeks before their families had it towed. The nature photographer from San Francisco was eventually declared dead by a court, his life insurance paying out to parents who would never stop wondering what had happened to their son. Local police ruled it a missing persons case and stopped asking questions because the questions led to places no one wanted to go. We moved on. That is how the job worked. We were not there to solve mysteries or to understand what lurked in the dark spaces between the trees. We were there to track, to document, and to try to bring people back alive. Sometimes we did. Sometimes we walked for days through forests that felt wrong in ways we could not explain. finding nothing but silence and ancient trees and the occasional reminder that others had come before us and had not come back. The Olympic case haunted me, though. At night in my motel room in Port Angeles, I would close my eyes and see that spiral of shoes, that burned earth at the center, those carvings stretching up into the darkness. I would hear the silence of the forest, the absolute absence of sound that had felt like being buried alive. And I would wonder about the people who had walked barefoot into that clearing, following something only they could see, something that had been waiting for them since before they were born. 2 weeks later, we were reassigned to Northern California, the Redwood National Forest, where a family of 4 had vanished from a campground in the middle of the night. Mother, father, 2 children ages 7 and 11. The campground host had seen them roasting marshmallows at 9 in the evening, laughing and telling stories around their fire. By 6 in the morning, when he made his rounds, their campsite was empty. The fire had burned down to cold ash. Their car was still parked in its designated spot. Their tent was still set up, sleeping bags still arranged inside as if waiting for sleepers who would never return. The food they had brought sat in coolers that had been raided by raccoons, but the family itself had simply ceased to exist. "This is different," Rachel said, studying the scene with an intensity that worried me. The others walked out willingly, drawn by something. "This feels more like they were taken." David made us set up base camp 2 miles from the vanishing site. He would not let us sleep anywhere near it. "These places," he explained as we erected our tents in a clearing that felt marginally less oppressive, "they get into your head. You start seeing things that might not be there, hearing things that might not be real. Start following their rules, and you end up following their rules right into the darkness." "You have been doing this for how long?" I asked him. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. 12 years. 11 cases that I cannot explain no matter how hard I try. 6 team members lost. 3 who quit. 2 who are in psychiatric facilities. And 1, he paused, one who walked into the forest one night and never came back. Said he heard his daughter calling for him. His daughter had been dead for 15 years. I did not sleep well that night. None of us did. At 2 in the morning, Aiden woke me from my watch shift. The forest around us was absolutely dark, the redwood canopy blocking any light from the stars above. I sat by our small fire, feeding it twigs to keep the flames alive, my rifle across my lap and my thoughts drifting to Lily. She would be sleeping now, safe in her bed at her mother's house, unaware that her father was sitting in the darkness of an ancient forest, hunting something he could not name or understand. I was thinking about calling her, about hearing her voice, when I heard the singing. A child's voice drifting through the trees, clear and sweet and absolutely impossible. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies." I keyed my radio with trembling fingers. "Anyone else hear that?" I whispered. Static answered me, then David's voice, tight with tension. "Stay in the light, Ethan. Do not look for the source. Whatever you do, do not follow it." But the singing continued, growing closer, more distinct. A little girl's voice, and then a boy joining in, harmonizing in a way that raised every hair on my body. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. And then laughter. Children's laughter in the darkness of the redwood forest at 2 in the morning, miles from the nearest town, in a place where a family with 2 children had vanished without explanation. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse, a held breath, an anticipation, and then a scream cut through the night, a sound that was almost human but not quite right, too high, too sustained, too perfectly controlled, like something learning to mimic human sounds but not quite understanding how they were supposed to work. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. Instead, I stayed by the fire, feeding it until the flames rose higher, and I waited for dawn. The scream did not come again. But sleep was impossible. When David emerged from his tent at first light, his face gray with exhaustion, I told him what I had heard. He nodded slowly. "It tests you," he said. "Whatever is out there, it learns. It watches and listens and figures out what will draw you in. The children, that family. It used their voices, did it not? The voices of the missing." I thought about the little girls singing, the boys' laughter, 7 and 11 years old, their parents had reported. About the same ages as the voices I had heard. "You think they are still alive?" I asked. David's silence was answer enough. "We searched for 3 more days. We found the father's hiking boots at the base of an enormous redwood tree, placed neatly side by side as if he had simply decided to walk barefoot into the forest. We found the mother's wedding ring half a mile away, sitting on a flat rock like an offering. We found one of the children's stuffed animals, a well-worn teddy bear, hanging from a branch 15 feet off the ground. We never found the family. On the fourth night, Marcus vanished from his tent. We had set watches, had taken every precaution, but somehow, between Rachel's shift and mine, he had unzipped his tent from the inside, left his boots and his radio and his flashlight behind, and walked into the forest in his socks. We found his trail leading northeast, the same direction as the family's disappearance, the same direction all the trails led. But after 200 yards, the footprints simply stopped, as if Marcus had been lifted off the ground and carried away. We searched until noon before David called it. "He is gone," he said flatly. "Whatever took him is beyond our ability to find. We extract now and report." I have never heard Rachel cry before, but she cried that day. Marcus had been with the team for 2 years. He had a wife and a newborn son in Portland. He had showed me pictures just 3 days earlier, proud and nervous and full of plans for the future. Now he was gone, another name to add to the list of the missing, another family left wondering if their loved one was dead or something worse. We left the redwood forest that afternoon. I did not look back, but I felt the weight of those ancient trees watching us go, patient and eternal, waiting for the next visitor to wander too deep into their shadows. Thomas was waiting for us at a regional office in Eureka with paperwork and next assignments. He did not mention Marcus. He did not offer condolences or explanations. He simply handed us new folders and new coordinates and expected us to continue. "How many?" I asked him, my voice tight with anger. "How many people has this program lost?" Thomas looked at me with those cold February eyes. 47 personnel since the program began in 1979. Another 312 civilians we were unable to save. The numbers are acceptable given the scope of the threat. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to scream that Marcus was not a number, that the families we had failed were not acceptable losses, that this whole operation was insanity dressed up as government work. But I thought about Lily. I thought about the child support payments and the custody arrangement and the life I was trying to rebuild. And I swallowed my rage and took the new folder. Oregon was next, Thomas said. The Cascade Range, emergency priority. An entire hiking party of 12 people had triggered an emergency beacon 3 hours ago and then gone silent. Whatever was happening in America's forests, it was escalating. We arrived in Oregon the next morning, a team of 5 now instead of 6. David, Rachel, Aiden, Elena, and me. We gathered at a staging area near the base of Mount Hood, our breath steaming in the cold mountain air as we reviewed the situation. The hiking party had been following a popular trail called the Timberline Route, a loop around the mountain that typically took 3 to 4 days. They were experienced outdoors people, members of a hiking club from Seattle, well-equipped and familiar with mountain conditions. They had checked in regularly via satellite phone for the first 2 days, reporting good weather and beautiful views. On the 3rd day, their emergency beacon had activated briefly, transmitting GPS coordinates from a location off the main trail. Then nothing. Search and rescue teams had attempted to reach the coordinates, but had turned back after 2 team members reported experiencing auditory hallucinations and extreme disorientation. One of them, a veteran ranger with 20 years of experience, had tried to walk off a cliff while insisting he was following his wife's voice. His wife had died in 2019. The Cascades were beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, snow-capped peaks rising above old-growth forests, the air crisp and clean, the silence broken only by wind and the occasional cry of an eagle. In other circumstances, this would have been paradise. Under current circumstances, it felt like walking into a trap. We found the hiking party's base camp by mid-afternoon. 12 tents arranged in a neat circle around a communal fire pit. 12 sets of gear, packs and poles and carefully organized supplies. 12 people simply gone. The fire pit contained the cold remains of a fire that looked like it had been built up large and then allowed to burn down over many hours. Someone had been feeding it through the night. Someone who was no longer here to explain why. "This is wrong," Aiden said, his voice low and tense. "This is exactly what Roy warned us about." David had briefed us on Roy during the flight to Oregon. He had been a team leader who had quit the program after the Wisconsin case, unable to continue, leaving behind only a note with 3 words: break the patterns. I never understood what that meant. Until now, staring at 12 empty tents, I thought I was beginning to. The patterns, I said slowly. The victims are not chosen randomly. They are chosen because they match something. Something the forest is looking for. Rachel looked at me sharply. What do you mean? I walked around the campsite, studying the gear, the personal items, the small details that told stories about the people who had left them behind. Look at this, I said. 12 people on a hiking trip, but look at what they brought. Photos of family members in every tent. Letters from children, from parents, from spouses. A birthday card that was supposed to be delivered next week. These people all had something they were missing, someone they wanted to get back to, something they wanted that they did not have. They were hungry, Rachel whispered. Not for food, for something else. For the life they wished they had. The life they were working toward. I nodded, and something found them. Something that knows how to use that hunger against them. We found the trail markers half a mile from the campsite, not official markers. These were made of stone stacked in careful cairns, each one topped with a small personal item from one of the missing hikers. A watch, a wedding ring, a photograph of 2 smiling children, a worn rosary, like offerings, Elena said quietly, or breadcrumbs. We followed the markers up the mountain into terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. The maintained trails had long since disappeared. We were climbing through boulder fields and scrambling up loose scree, always higher, always deeper into wilderness that felt like it had never known human footsteps despite the cairns that marked our way. The sun was setting when we reached the cave. It was not a natural formation. The entrance was too regular, too precisely carved into the volcanic rock of the mountainside. Looking at it made my head hurt in ways I could not explain, as if my eyes were refusing to fully process what they were seeing. And from inside the cave, I could hear breathing, multiple sources, slow and deep and perfectly synchronized. Ethan, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Look at the ground. I looked down. Footprints, dozens of them, overlapping, all different sizes, leading into the cave, none leading out. The 12 hikers went in there, I said. Alive, Aiden added, or something wearing their shapes. I clicked on my flashlight and entered the cave. The chamber opened up 20 feet in, revealing something that should not have existed. The walls were covered in carvings, thousands of them stretching back into darkness that my flashlight could not penetrate. Stick figures and spirals and symbols that seemed to shift when I was not looking directly at them. Animals that were almost recognizable but wrong, with too many legs or heads or eyes. And in the center of the chamber, arranged in concentric circles like some kind of ceremonial formation, sat people. The 12 hikers, all alive, all sitting perfectly still with their eyes open and their faces slack. They were not moving, not blinking, barely breathing. Maybe once every 30 seconds their chests would rise and fall in perfect unison, and then they would be still again. What the hell? Elena started to move forward, her medical training overriding her survival instincts. That is when they opened their eyes, all 12 of them simultaneously, and smiled identical smiles that stretched too wide across their faces. He is hungry, they said together, their voices overlapping in a way that made them sound like one creature with 12 mouths. So hungry. We feed him our want, our need, our everything, and he gives us peace. We feed him, and we are finally full. The cave started to change around us. The walls rippled like water, the stone becoming fluid, the carvings beginning to move. Stick figures walking across rock that should have been solid, spirals spinning slowly inward, and from the darkness at the back of the chamber, something emerged. I cannot describe it. My mind will not let me hold the full memory, but I remember antlers. So many antlers growing from a skull that was too large to be real, spreading outward like branches of a dead tree. I remember eyes that held depths beyond comprehension, eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall, eyes that had seen the first humans walk into these forests and had learned how to call them deeper into the dark. And I remember a mouth that should not have been able to smile but did. Ethan Walker, it said, and its voice was every missing person, every victim, every desperate moment I had ever felt. You came looking for them, but you are just as lost, just as hungry. You want your daughter back. You want to stop being a failure. You want to be the father she deserves. I can give you all of that. I can fill the empty spaces inside you. All I ask is that you sit, rest, let me ease your wanting. And I almost did, because it was offering me everything. I could see it playing out in front of me like a movie, Lily running toward me with her arms open wide. The house I had lost, restored and warm and filled with light. The marriage I had destroyed, healed and whole. The man I used to be before the depression and the debts and the failures, standing in front of me with his hand extended, ready to welcome me back. All I had to do was sit down. All I had to do was stop fighting, stop wanting, stop trying. All I had to do was let go. Aiden's rifle shot brought me back. He had fired into the ceiling of the cave, and the creature, if that is what it was, recoiled from the sound like an animal confronted with flame. The hikers broke from their trance, their faces suddenly confused, terrified, human again. "Run!" Aiden screamed. "Everyone run now!" We ran. The cave collapsed behind us as we emerged into twilight. The entire mountainside shuddered and groaned, rocks tumbling from above, the ground splitting beneath our feet. Somewhere far below, I heard screaming, the 12 hikers maybe, or the thing that had been wearing their hunger like a coat. I do not know. I did not look back. We made it to our vehicles by midnight, driving without stopping until we reached Portland. Thomas was waiting at a safe house with termination papers and non-disclosure agreements. "The program is being shut down," he said without preamble. "Too many incidents, too many personnel lost. The cost-benefit analysis no longer supports continued operations. You will receive full payment for your remaining contract period and a substantial severance bonus. In exchange, you will never speak of what you have seen or experienced." I stared at him with something close to hatred. The people in that cave. We left them. "They were already gone," Thomas replied evenly. "You understand that now, surely." The moment they walked into the darkness voluntarily, they were gone. The thing in that cave does not take people, it waits for them to give themselves. You cannot save someone who has already chosen to stop fighting. You can only document. That has always been the mission. I signed the papers. I took the money. I flew back to Seattle and tried to rebuild the life I had been running from when I took this job in the first place. That was 3 months ago. I paid off all my debts with the severance bonus. I moved into a small apartment in Belltown with a view of the water. I got a job at a community center teaching wilderness survival skills. Ironic work for someone who had learned how few survival skills actually mattered when the forest decided to take you. I see my daughter every other weekend now, the custody arrangement finally working in my favor for the first time in years. Lily is 11 years old with her mother's eyes and my stubborn streak. And when she hugs me, I can almost forget the things I have seen, almost forget the sounds of 12 voices speaking in unison, almost forget the antlers and the eyes and the smile, almost forget the feeling of wanting to sit down and let go and finally be at peace. But I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and sleep will not come. The voices in the forest, singing and promising and offering to ease every ache, every want, every desperate need. I hear them especially when things get hard, when the bills pile up again, when Lily's mother threatens to revise the custody arrangement, when I feel the old familiar weight of failure pressing down on my chest like a stone. In those moments, I remember exactly where the hungry places are. Olympic, California, Oregon. I have coordinates. I have maps. I have the knowledge burned into my memory of exactly where the darkness waits for those who are tired enough to stop fighting. And I know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that someday, when the weight of the world gets too heavy, when my daughter's voice on the phone is not enough to anchor me, when the empty spaces inside grow too large to ignore, I know I will go back. We all go back eventually. That is what the folklore is really about, not the monster in the woods. The hunger inside us, the wanting that never stops no matter how much we achieve or acquire or accomplish. The creature does not make you walk into darkness. It just waits there, patient as stone, ancient as the mountains, knowing that sooner or later everyone gets hungry enough to seek relief. I keep a note in my wallet, 3 words written on a scrap of paper that I found in David's tent after we returned from Oregon. Break the patterns. He had left it there for me, I think, knowing that I was the one most likely to need the reminder. break the patterns. But patterns are just another name for the paths we walk because we are too tired to forge new ones. And I am so very tired. The phone rang yesterday at 3 in the morning, jarring me from a nightmare I could not remember but felt in my bones. Unknown number from a blocked caller. I answered because that is what I do now, answer calls from unknown numbers at ungodly hours, because some part of me is always waiting for the next assignment. Ethan. Thomas's voice was exactly as I remembered it, cold and precise and utterly devoid of human warmth. We are reinstating the program. Different approach. Higher pay. Selective recruitment. We have been analyzing patterns in the disappearances, and we believe a new methodology might yield better results. We think you learned something important out there, something we can use. I should have said no. I should have hung up and blocked the number and gone back to my life teaching survival skills to suburban hikers who would never face anything more dangerous than a twisted ankle. I should have thought about Lily and the custody arrangement and all the reasons I had for staying safe and normal and present in her life. But I thought about the bills that were starting to pile up again. I thought about the car that needed repairs I could not afford. I thought about my ex-wife's lawyer sending letters about revised support calculations. I thought about the ache of being ordinary in a world that did not care whether I lived or died or disappeared into the forest like all the others. When do I start? I asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, in that flat, effectless voice that I had come to associate with the worst news possible, he said, "You already have. Check your email." Washington, Olympic National Forest, 15 missing in 2 weeks. Whatever is there, it is feeding well. The email contained coordinates I recognized. They were less than 3 miles from the clearing with the spiral of shoes, the burned earth, the carved message that read, "They are still hungry." 15 people in 2 weeks. The thing in Olympic was no longer waiting for the hungry to come to it. It was calling them, drawing them in. The folklore has 1,000 names for what lives in America's wild places. Wendigo in the northern forests, a creature of endless hunger that was once human before starvation twisted it into something beyond recognition. Skinwalker in the southwest, a witch wearing the skin of animals, calling travelers from the trail with voices of loved ones. Dogman in the Midwest, something that walks on 2 legs but moves through the forest like a predator born to the darkness. Tree whistler in the Pacific Northwest, a sound that draws people deeper into old-growth forests from which they never return. But they are all the same thing underneath. The thing that knows what you want. The thing that offers to take the pain of wanting away. The thing that waits in the darkness with patient, eternal hunger, knowing that sooner or later everyone gets tired enough to stop fighting. I am packing my bags tonight. The equipment Thomas sent is already sitting in my hallway. Familiar gear that I know how to use, that I know will not save me when the time comes. I called Lily before I started packing, told her I had a work trip coming up, might be out of contact for a few days. She asked me where I was going and I told her Washington, the forests, doing some consulting work for the Park Service. She said she loved me and to be careful. I told her I loved her too. I leave for Olympic in the morning, back to where I started, closing the circle. I tell myself it is for Lily, for the money, for all the sensible reasons that sound good when you say them out loud. But late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the city lights paint shadows on my walls, I hear the singing. I see those antlers in my mind, spreading like dead branches, reaching out toward me across the darkness. I remember that perfect moment in the cave when the creature offered me everything, when I could see the life I wanted laid out before me like a gift, when all I had to do was stop fighting and let go. And I know the truth that I have been hiding from myself since I first walked out of the Olympic wilderness 3 months ago. I am not going to hunt it. I am going to find it. We are all hungry here at the end. The only question is what we are willing to feed to the darkness to fill the empty spaces inside us. The only question is how much wanting we can bear before we follow the voices into the trees, barefoot and willing, walking toward the promise of peace. I guess I am about to find out. The forest is waiting. It has always been waiting. And somewhere in the darkness between the ancient trees, something is smiling, patient as stone, hungry as winter, knowing that I am coming back to it, that I was always going to come back, that every step I have taken since I left its domain has been leading me in a spiral back to the center where the ground is burned black and the shoes pile up like offerings. Break the patterns, David wrote. But some patterns are stronger than will. Some patterns are carved into us by want and need, and all the empty spaces we cannot fill no matter how hard we try. I will drive to Olympic tomorrow. I will walk into the Hoh rainforest with my gear and my training, and my desperate hope that this time will be different. I will follow the trail of the 15 missing into whatever darkness has claimed them, and somewhere along the way I will hear my daughter's voice calling to me from the trees. I will see her standing in a clearing, arms open, asking me why I left her, why I am never there when she needs me, why I keep failing her over and over again. I will know it is not really her. I will know it is something else wearing her voice like a mask. And I do not know if I will be strong enough to keep walking. That is the truth that keeps me awake at night. Not the monster, not the darkness. The fear that when the moment comes, when the creature offers me everything I have ever wanted, I will say yes. I will sit down among the others who have given themselves to the hungry dark. I will let go of the wanting and the needing and the endless exhausting struggle to be enough. I will find peace in the only way that peace can be found when you are broken and tired and lost. The forest knows. It has always known. That is why it waits with such patience, such certainty. It knows that everyone breaks eventually. Everyone gets hungry enough.